Chapter 11:23. Who said that only he could use his origin equipment. Especially when he could no longer use it, the best choice was to give the weapon to someone who could use it to its fullest potential. The green-crowned dragon's breath of decay was not poison in the first place. Instead, it was the manifestation of decay and aging. Anyone who came into contact with it would begin to age at an unimaginable speed. If one were to use the game's mechanics to understand, it would not attack the HP bar. Instead, it would directly reduce the HP limit. Even with the Heretic King's resistance, he was still hit countless times by Fangzhou's thousands of attacks in an instant. That body was now nearing the end of its lifespan. The leakless golden embryo was destroyed by itself. I see. The Heretic King nodded in realization. He was not angry, nor was he shaken. His withered face was as calm as ever. Such wisdom is indeed worthy of praise. He said, "Why sure, you did well." At that moment, Why sure did not feel any joy or pride. The premonition of death once again engulfed him completely. It was as if he had fallen into the depths of a dark abyss. His soul trembled and he found it difficult to breathe. Because in the eyes of the Heretic King, everything in the world seemed to have disappeared. He did not even care about the strong enemies that were close at hand. Only Huaishur was left. 1 month, half a month, 1 week, 3 days, 1 day. Feeling his lifespan rapidly decreasing, the heretic monarch slowly exhaled the remaining breath in his lungs. The shriveled body spasmed as if it had been electrocuted. It quickly swelled, and his heartbeat was like thunder. The originally skinny and short silhouette slowly grew. In the end, it turned into a giant that walked out of the furnace, emitting endless heat. Supreme praise wine, supreme fanqing, supreme peace and tranquility. Countless skills that ordinary people could not imagine appeared and gathered in that broken body. It maintained the final time limit and completely froze its own time. Its power began to expand and increase in a self-destructive manner. Since there were still many cards left, he gave up on the idea of returning to receive treatment. Instead, he used this useless body as a consumable tool. There was only one thing left to do. Kill Huaishur. Let's go. Fangzhou was even faster than him. The moment the Heretic King entered his transformation, his figure appeared hundreds of meters away. He stretched out his hand and grabbed Huaishur, pulling him up from the ground. Ignoring the mountain ghost's endurance, he threw him out with all his might. The sound of cannonballs breaking through the air rang out. Huaishur didn't even have time to scream before he was crushed by the oncoming wind pressure and went into shock. After a short moment, he saw everything quickly moving away. Yin and yang stimulated each other, and electricity generated magnetism. Under the ejection of the heavenly fault, he had already become a cannonball of an electromagnetic cannon and was shot out. But at that moment the heretic monarch had already taken a step forward. The 10,000 zhang thunder prison was completely shattered. The resentful water flashed out from the thunder and pierced through his body, but he didn't care about it at all. He allowed Yun Zhongjuan's thunderbolts to wreak havoc and destroy his body. The Heretic King took another step forward and stomped on the ground. His huge body instantly shrunk into a ball. Immediately after, his toes, ankles, knees, and even his hip bones accelerated layer by layer, bursting forth with a terrifying speed that was not inferior to any spacecraft. It flew towards Huaishur. "Don't even think about it!" Yun Zhongjuan roared angrily. Frost and wind gathered, and the rain was like a blade, blocking the front of the broken body. However, whether it was the thunder prison, wind wall, endless rain, or the frost blades mixed in, none of them could stop the Heretic King's advance. He was pierced through bit by bit. Even the air was smashed into a human-shaped gap. The Heretic Monarch's advance was faster than the speed of sound, leaving a pale and straight trail wherever he passed. His pure power was fully displayed at this moment. He took Fangzhou's bombardment head-on, ignoring the repeated slashes and piercing of the blade of purification. Even though his body was already riddled with holes under the piercing of thunder and the burning of electric light, he still didn't falter or slow down. He had locked down his health and used a cheat. In the mighty roar of the sea, the outline of the Kuanping once again appeared in front of the heretic king. The heavenly fault descended and condensed into a solid form. The towering Thunder City collided with the heretic king. However, after an instant of roar, the heretic king's figure mysteriously disappeared on the spot. After reappearing in the heavenly fault, his speed didn't slow down at all. In fact, he was even accelerating. Supreme tier, split air. Right in front of him was Huai-Shi, who had fallen to the ground. Then, he raised his left hand that was full of wounds again and clenched his 5 fingers tightly. At that moment, even the heretic monarch, who was as cold as steel, couldn't help but feel a trace of pity. In the future, he might be able to become the successor of the heretic king's legacy, right? What a pity today. I will kill your soul with my own hands right here and now. Supreme tier, spirit urge. In an instant, the soul-killing fist that could destroy the consciousness of all opponents and cause them to fall into eternal slumber brazenly smashed down. Electric light flashed, and the sound of steel shattering burst forth. The hate-water spear wailed and shattered inch by inch. The lightning that had been purified to the extreme exploded, completely destroying his left arm and evaporating it. Die! The heretic king didn't hesitate. He raised his broken right hand again and aimed his remaining thumb at Huai-Shi's face. Then, he thrust it forward like a spear. A cold voice sounded. The heretic king said, "Dream on." At that moment, blood spurted out and dyed Huai-Shi's face red. Ing Fangzhou. Right in front of Huai-Shi, the arrogant figure trembled. A tragic hole had been pierced through his chest, and one of his arms was cut off. The lightning that filled the sky retracted from his other hand and aimed at the wound on the heretic king's chest. Then, it blasted out and seeped into the heretic king's heart. The lightning rose and gushed out like a waterfall from the wound left by the sword saint. It destroyed the remaining life force from the inside out. The heretic king's movement finally stopped in place. He didn't move anymore. However, on the charred body, the broken eye blinked with difficulty, revealing the last of its spirit and ferocity. Then, a voice that was close by sounded. It was an order from Ing Fangzhou. He said, "Huai-Shi." At that moment, behind Ing Fangzhou, Huai-Shi no longer hesitated. He seized this short opportunity and stabbed forward with the sword of virtue, piercing through Ing Fangzhou's body. From bottom to top, it stabbed diagonally into the heretic king's throat and wedged into the gap between the cervical vertebrae. Forward again. Decapitation. This was the last straw that crushed the heretic king's body. Crack. With the soft sound of a bubble bursting, the head that was full of cracks fell from the shoulder, and the body fell to the sky. There was no more sound. At the last moment, only a sigh of pity was left. Very good. As the nirvana stopped, the heretic king's corpse began to swell violently. Then, it collapsed and quickly disintegrated. Endless blood turned into a torrent and gushed out like a waterfall. In the end, it formed a scarlet river. Huai-Shi couldn't be bothered to admire the strange scenery anymore. He propped himself up with the sword and supported the fallen Ing Fangzhou. Then, he slowly placed him on the ground. Hey! Hey! Old Ing, can you hear me? Hang in there, hang in there. Huai-Shi swung his hand and threw the flower wreath on his wrist into the river of blood behind him. In an instant, the roots of the plants spread in the blood and grew rapidly. They actually bloomed into pitch-black lotus flowers. The black lotus flowers with golden edges grew and died. All the vitality gathered in Huai-Shi's hand along the mountain ghost's network. He didn't heal himself first. Instead, he turned around and wrapped the roots around Ing Fangzhou's body, trying to extend his life. Unfortunately, no matter how much vitality was injected, Yun Zhongjuan's injuries still didn't improve. In the wound on his chest, Where the heretic king had pierced through, fragments of his bones and internal organs kept falling out. The killing intent from the abyss still lingered in it, lingering. It couldn't grow or heal at all. In fact, even his heart had stopped beating. He was on the verge of death. It's just a small injury. Why are you panicking? Fangzhou looked up and glanced at him. He reprimanded in a hoarse voice, outrageous. Why are you still so stubborn at a time like this, old Ing? Huaishir was infuriated. Can you stop pretending? This is the second time you've died, and you still want to tell me that you have experience? Can't you just listen to my advice for once? Get out of the way. Fangzhou raised his only arm and slapped Huaishir away. He used the last of his strength to reach into the wound on his chest and hold his heart tightly. Then, a dazzling electric light flashed. Bang! Accompanied by a low sound, the dying body suddenly shook, and blood spurted out of the wound. Then, another low sound was heard. A third time, a fourth time, when Fangzhou's palm slowly loosened, the heart that was full of cracks had resumed beating. Then, his palm roughly wiped the wounds on his chest and shoulder, forcibly gouging out the traces of the heretic king's destruction. Under the dazzling electric light, all the wounds were covered with a layer of scorch marks. It was the first time Huaishir saw such a hardcore surgery. He was already stunned. Electric shock pacing, removing the lesion, suturing the wound. It was unknown how many times he had done it, but Fangzhou did it smoothly and smoothly. When he came to his senses, Yun Zhongjuan was already out of the dying state. Now, he looked at him from the corner of his eyes, scrutinizing. What did you just call me? Huaishir blinked and squeezed out an innocent smile. I forgot. In the long silence, Fangzhou looked at him. After a long time, he sighed softly and said nothing. Help me up, he said. The two of them did not stay in the same place for long. Now, in order to protect Huaishir, Fangzhou took the heretic king's all-out sacrificial punch and was completely injured. He was out of danger. However, he did not know what kind of supreme effect it was, but the wound could not be healed at all. He could only barely maintain his condition. No one knew what kind of opponent would use evil methods to descend from the sky. They had just sent away the most basic, ascetic. If the opponent turned around and used the heretic king, which was the real one after falling into the abyss, they were afraid that they would die here. After taking back the garland again, Huaishir carried Fangzhou on his back and trudged all the way. Soon, the motorcycle that was left in the same place was dug out of the ground again. Fortunately, the frame was still intact. There were also backups for the few broken parts. After a little cleaning, it could still be driven. The quality was so high that it was really touching. However, the person sitting in the back of the motorcycle this time was Fangzhou. Huaishir took out a piece of cloth that was stuffed in the corner and carefully covered him with it. Just as he was about to move, he heard Fangzhou's voice. The situation now is different from when we set off. Yun Zhongjuan, who was seriously injured, asked softly. Can you still walk, Huaishir? Of course. Huaishir covered the corner of the stall and replied calmly, We're already here, aren't we? Fangzhou sighed softly. It's up to you to decide, he said. I'm afraid I can't protect you, Huaishir. Okay. Huaishir stretched out his hand, twisted the accelerator, and started the motorcycle. As the motorcycle vibrated, he held the helmet in his hand and was silent for a while. Suddenly, he said, Actually, I know how to repair things like machinery. I know, Fangzhou said. Huaishir thought for a moment and said seriously, I can work harder. I know. Fangzhou nodded. Huaishir laughed and finally said to him, Also, thank you. Fangzhou was silent for a long time. Okay, he said. I'm tired. I'll rest for a while. With that, he leaned back in the chair, closed his eyes, and stopped talking. It was as if he had fallen asleep. Huaishir lowered his head, put on the helmet, and pulled down the mask. I'm sorry, Mr. Isaac. He whispered softly, I don't care about other things. The vice principal's puzzled voice sounded. This time, I'm afraid the task of saving the world will be handed over to you, Huaishur said expressionlessly. I'm going to kill those stupid Golden Dawn bastards. After a short silence, there was a pleasant laughter. There was no resistance or displeasure. It was full of indulgence. Come on, he said. Thus, the motorcycle rumbled. Dust was raised. It drove into the distance again. Chapter 11:24. That's about the situation. The vice principal's message came from the other side of the battlefield. Madam Chen, it seems like you'll have to take charge of this side. Are you finally getting a little motivated? On the top of the squatting steel giant, the wind with the scent of blood blew the metal earrings, and a crisp sound was heard. Madam Chen spat out a mouthful of thick smoke with the smell of diesel from the gap between her teeth. She grinned. That kid looks lazy, but he's still ambitious, but, since he doesn't need my help, I won't hold back then. You can do whatever you want. No one will doubt your talent. Isaac calmly stretched out his hand and threw out another frame card, shrouding the Creator's law in the silent battlefield. Layers of buildings rose from the ground between the blood and the corpses of the hell creatures. In the distance, on the peak of the mountain range, the wilderness covered in snow, the deep lake, and the turbulent ocean, the top of the outposts lit up. Countless lights surged in the sky, connecting with the transfer stations scattered all over the fragment, once again forming a brand new network of origin substance. Wherever it passed, all the blood, corpses, and even the tragic scene disappeared, and everything rose from the light. At this moment, the battlefield full of cracks and burn marks seemed to have been purified by the light, turning into a paradise on earth. Between the opened books, a pure white tower that was no different from the land of dreams gathered. It was not established by a book or a person's words, but by countless records of things and history. They merged and intersected with each other, and the miracle of things refined by things appeared again. Human intelligence barrier, ivory tower. The lights of the past were lit up again, and behind the open door, the white doves from hell returned once again. Everything is ready, Madam Chen. The purser from the iron crystal waved at Anubis from the top of the building. All equipment adjustments have been completed. Along the tracks, dozens of maintenance vehicles dragged the huge steel giant and sent it into the brand new workshop. Under the cover of hundreds of mechanical arms, the old armor was removed, revealing complicated cables and structures. They changed the source furnace, corrected the strength of the bones, replenished the supply of origin substance, and more importantly, changed the radar and engine. The brand new equipment was embedded into the sleeping giant's body like internal organs. The wolf's iron face became even colder and more ferocious, and the 4 eyes shot out scarlet light again. Flashing electric sparks fell from the huge welding torch. Madam Chen looked up at the giant in front of her, raised her hands, and tried to clench her fists. As if she could feel the power surging in the giant's body, her smile became excited. Thank you, old Jiang. What are you talking about? It's my duty. The purser shrugged helplessly. But it would be better if you could change the way you address me. Won't that make us seem familiar? Madam Chen put her hand on his shoulder. Didn't you call me Xiao Chen before? The purser smiled mischievously. Then should I call you Little Jing or Awan? After a short moment of silence, Madam Chen's expression gradually became more amiable. Then we can only go and practice. Fine, fine, fine. I won't talk about this anymore. You're already the vice principal, but you still beat up the elderly all day. I think this celestial genealogy is finished. The purser waved his hand and begged for mercy. Let's talk about business. Business? Fight, build houses, recruit people, then do more fights, build more houses, recruit more people. Isn't this the right thing to do? Madam Chen moved her body on the spot, nimbly stretching her body. She suddenly asked, Where's the closest enemy? To the east. The purser replied without hesitation, It's 1,200 kilometers in a straight line. There are a total of 16 large groups and 2 legions. It seems that there are already Tier 5 consolidators. It won't be easy to take them down. Isn't that good? There's only a challenge when there's difficulty. It's much easier than someone going to challenge Golden Dawn alone. Madame Chun stepped on the ladder and jumped onto Anubis' knee. With a nimble flip, she stepped on the cockpit. She turned around and asked, "How many people are here now?" The purser lowered his head and looked at his watch. "Mr. Liu, Mr. Adrian, and Ms. Fuji are all ready. White Dream should be back in half an hour. 2 white doves, 1 gray stork, and 1 black whale. This lineup shouldn't be a problem, right?" "What about you?" Madame Chen asked. "Aren't you going to move?" "I originally wanted to, but unfortunately, it's time for tea." The purser spread his hands and smiled. "I'm afraid you'll have to do more work. Tisk, they're all a bunch of lazy bums." She shook her head and jumped into the cockpit. Accompanied by the sound of steel rubbing against each other, the squatting steel giant opened the ceiling and stood on the ground again. It took a step forward. It caused the ground to shake. Dust flew everywhere, and a crack suddenly appeared in the huge square. Just behind the huge gate, in the darkness under the ground, sparks flew on countless steel frames and rails. Accompanied by the screeching sound of steel rubbing against each other, a strong wind rose from the depths of the ground. Wrapped by steel cables and dust-proof cloth, a slender and huge sealed cabinet popped out from under the rails. It was even dozens of meters taller than Anubis. From the cracks of the sealed cabinet, wisps of pale cold air leaked out, causing the temperature of the entire square to drop. When Anubis reached out his hand and connected to the system, the complicated origin form matrix and the secret key were combined together. Ms. Chen, account login complete. Authorization verification complete. Accompanied by the urgent alarm, the sealed cabinet began to collapse and crack. When pieces of heavy steel plates fell to the ground, the machinery sleeping in the extreme cold and darkness seemed to be alive. Dozens of cables extended and wrapped around Anubis' arm. They grew upwards and connected to the dozens of plugs on its back. Dozens of bolts were nailed into the giant's skeleton. Then, welding light burst out. The metal expanded as if it was alive and covered Anubis' body. It was like the giant had put on a charging armor. It was seamless and had ferocious edges. In the end, on Anubis' right hand, the huge object shrunk in the cabinet was like a ferocious beast. It glowed and roared. Its curled body completely unfolded, turning into a ferocious weapon more than 94 meters long. "How do you feel?" Simmons' voice came from the communication device. A happy whistle sounded. "That's great. Then I'll wait here for the good news, madam." "Don't give me that. This nickname was given to me by these guys." In the cockpit, the pilot clicked her tongue and pressed the last button. "The MS in my login name is not the abbreviation of Miss at all. Isn't this quite interesting?" Simmons smiled and finally said, "No matter what, I wish you a happy hunt." "Don't worry, I will." The sublimator raised her head and allowed the cold cable to be inserted into her spine. A burning pain erupted from her soul. In the cockpit, the tiny body seemed to have turned into ashes in an instant in the furnace. What replaced it was an armored giant standing on the ground. In her hand, the tip of the weapon that looked like a giant spear spewed out a dazzling scarlet. As she waved it, a low whistling sound spread out and left a flag-like trail in the air. Verification complete, authorization approved, level 6 drive, dragon spear form release. Annihilation echo, dragon summoning flute activate. Just like countless times in the past, Anubis opened its mouth and swallowed the killing intent from the underworld. It roared silently. Thus, under the push of the dazzling fire, it rose into the air. Mobile suit Chen Wenjing attack. In the land of the Great Swamp, on both sides of the vast river, thick fog shrouded everything like a curtain. No one could see the changes clearly. No matter how close they were, they could only see the constantly changing silhouette in the mist. It was like a mountain range, like a palace in the sky, like a building. However, under the cover of the fog, there was only a lush and dense forest. Among the countless giant trees that could hardly be hugged by two people, there were many antique palaces and pavilions. And right in front of the main hall, on the square, a stream of light suddenly descended from the sky. The card from the present realm was here. But this time, 4 figures of different heights and sizes fell out of it. With a bang, they rolled on the ground as if they were carsick and staggered. F***CK. Who's going to respond to Super Shurji next time? The thin and tall one who was pressed at the bottom coughed violently. 4 people sharing a card, it feels so crowded. There are 800 people sharing a card, and I don't see anyone complaining. You should look at your own problem. Hey, you're stepping on my hand. Move, my leg is about to break. The sublimator at the bottom struggled with difficulty. When he raised his head and saw the helpless waiting beside him, his eyes lit up. Enlightened Lord, quickly pull me up. The white-haired middle-aged man helplessly stretched out his hand, and in any case, separated the entangled fellows. Although he had given many instructions, no matter how many times he did it, he couldn't help but sigh. It was really too much for their limbs to be so slack, and after they got up, they began to look around. Oh, F***CK, even the One King's spirit enclosure was taken down? It's a wonder of the country. This thing isn't easy to use, at least dig a few layers below. Look at our Jixia, there's always a basement under the basement. What's the Wi-Fi? I still have to organize the Mo King's support today. Enlightened Lord, do you have an umbrella? I feel like I'm about to die from the sun. Looking at these people who were either giving advice, curious babies, or dying. Enlightened Lord just wanted to cover his face and sigh. After so many years, the people had changed, and this generation's Jixia 4 prodigies were still the same? Azure Sun, Zhu Ming, Baizong, Xianying. With the 4 seasons as their names, they represented the 4 legacies that had been passed down from the era of the gods to the present day in Jixia Academy. The 4 essences of Eastern Xia's orthodox alchemy. Alchemy, sword forging, wondrous artifacts, and yin-yang transformation. It was a pity that none of the 4 types required contact with society. All of them were just squatting at home. After thousands of years of inheritance, countless generations of inheritors had just opened their eyes in Jixia and never thought of going out in their entire lives. Ever since the previous generations Lu Wu pulled in the internet cable, there was no need to mention it. Unless they took a delivery, they would lose if they took a step out of the door. This time, Di Ting had spent a lot of effort to drag them out of their nest. Apart from the weird temperament and the incomprehensible way of thinking that only the otakus of Jixia could understand, what stood here now was an encyclopedia of all the secrets, spells, smithing, and production techniques of Dongxia since ancient times. It was not an exaggeration to call it the crystallization of civilization. With just a casual glance, they knew all the details of the secret rituals that Enlightened Lord had painstakingly designed. This allowed Kaming to heave a sigh of relief. With such a character in charge, he would not have to worry about the logistics anymore, as he was only there to make up the numbers. Everyone, please follow me. The old lady and Mr. Kwafu are still waiting. Enlightened Lord turned around and led the way. I need your help with some work. Do we need to prepare anything in advance? Xianying, who was the most proficient in yin-yang transformation and secret rituals, asked. Some rituals still require fasting and burning of the meter. It's most convenient if it doesn't involve sacrifice, but I'm afraid there will be problems if the materials are not available. Enlightened Lord's expression froze. He wanted to say something but stopped. In the end, he just waved his hand. Don't worry, it's not that troublesome. It's just planting trees. Planting trees? Azure Sun was stunned. Then what do we need Kwafu for? After a long silence, enlightened Lord awkwardly looked away and into the distance. To be planted. Chapter 11:25. The closer they got to the back of the mountain, the more they could feel the difference between the inside and outside of the spirit boundary. Under Lu Shu's management, although the layout of the spirit enclosure was not flexible and rigid, it perfectly utilized the geographical advantage and did not reveal any blind spots or flaws. However, it was completely different outside the spirit boundary. The moment he walked out of the door, it was as if he had left the human world and arrived in a strange demonic realm. A wild world unfolded before his eyes. Countless plants and trees grew wildly. Snakes, insects, rats, and ants moved up and down under the branches and leaves. The silhouettes of beasts and birds could be seen from afar, looking at them vigilantly. Pure origin substances floated in the air. Countless trees were full of vitality, causing one's eyes to light up. After getting used to the dead and desolate feeling of Gaia, coming to such a domain again made him feel as though he had come back to life. It's actually a spiritual land? Bai Zhang's eyes lit up. His hands began to feel around the giant trees and vines around him. He even lay on the ground, studying the flow of origin substance and the flow of earth qi. He couldn't help but become entranced. Zhu Ming pulled out a small knife, cut open the bark, and sucked the juice from the blade. His eyes lit up. Wonderful! Feng Shui and geomancy were naturally one of the changes in yin and yang, especially sword forging and heavenly work. Both of them relied heavily on the special environment and land. Now they could naturally sense that the dark soil not only contained the vitality of all living things, but also the pure will of death accumulated in it. When life and death flowed around each other, they formed a huge cycle. Under the silence was a constant struggle and killing. This seemingly calm forest was, in fact, filled with noise and intense changes that ordinary people could not detect. In the end, what appeared before his eyes was the so-called nature. It was as if it was a natural phenomenon. There was no trace of artificial smoke or fire. Tiancheng the miracle hand. Stop looking, stop looking. Let's go. Lu Shu could only helplessly drag the four of them to the place where the ceremony would take place. Finally, he brought them to the place where the ceremony would take place. In the deepest part of this dense forest, in a patch of green and gloomy darkness, the birds were singing and the flowers were blooming. And some unlucky children had already been thrown into the flames of hell. Wait, 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 please. AI. In the deep pit, Kwafu screamed incoherently, tears streaming down his face. Under the binding of the layers of vines, it struggled and wriggled like a maggot. It was a fancy way of begging for mercy. Old lady, give me one more chance, give me one more chance, he cried. I've done meritorious deeds for the eastern summer country, I've shed my blood for the country, I want to see the blackbird, I want to see the blackbird. Don't be afraid. I'm not a man-eating monster. The old-fashioned girl held the shovel and comforted him considerately. If you want to look for the mystic bird, you'll naturally be able to see it when you return alive. Bear with it for now. Don't worry, it'll stop hurting very soon. Kwafu was still wriggling in fear. He widened his eyes and said, You'll die soon, right? So be it. What's there to be afraid of? After burying half of Kwafu's body, Juju wiped the sweat from his forehead and smiled kindly. Besides, even primary school students know that children can only grow faster if there is fertilizer. I'm just a child too. I'm still young, old lady. I'm still single. I don't even have a girlfriend. I'm so miserable. Then who will die if not you? Juju threw another shovel of dirt at his face. This is nature, Abao. Survival of the fittest, and the losers eat the dust. The winner takes everything, and the loser not only has no meaning in life, but may also be single until death. You have to learn to accept reality. I don't want such a tragic reality. Kwafu yelled in despair. What kind of nature is this? It's not natural at all. Then what is nature? Juju asked indifferently. Is the storm natural? Is the flood natural? Is it natural that there are ascendants among the upright ape men? Is Kwafu natural? Is it not natural to burn forests and reclaim wastelands? There are always boring guys who like to use human morality to criticize and understand the world. They want the laws and phenomena of nature to operate according to their own set of benevolent rules, but they have no skills and ability. When they talk endlessly, their words seem ridiculous and superfluous. Juju added dirt into the pit unhurriedly and patiently told him, the so-called nature is nature. It's what has happened and will happen. It's the world in front of you. In nature, people are no different from plants and trees. If one wanted to survive, he needed soil. If one wanted to grow, he needed nutrients. Blindly being benevolent and tolerant was just the way of rotten wood. It would be difficult to achieve great things. Blindly being at peace was tantamount to sitting and waiting for decay. It would not bear fruit. There were only vegetables and flowers in the greenhouse, but if one wanted to become a pillar, he had to go to nature. The hundreds of generations of heroes in the human world were like towering trees. All of them were proof of struggle. A drop of rain, a ray of sunlight, a grain of soil, a gust of wind. If one wanted to grow, he had to fight, and snatch with others. Only after countless victories in battle would one be able to see the growth of time. Nature was reincarnated, and all things fought. In life there was death. Therefore, the Qing Emperor was not benevolent. In this spiritual land brimming with vitality, under those verdant trees, there were countless corpses entangled by layers of roots. At this moment, accompanied by thunder in the distance, the sky gradually darkened. Layers of dark clouds covered the last light, leaving only thunder and lightning. Not long after, a torrential downpour of rain poured down. The rain that contained fierce poison and hell's precipitation fell into the forest. In the silence between the thunder there was the sound of growth. The grass and trees swayed in the frost. The vines spread in the poisonous rain. All things grew. What good luck! Juju looked at the gloomy sky and smiled. It's a good weather for growth. In this way, the last layer of soil was covered. Under the soil, there was no more sound. What are you waiting for? She turned back, glanced behind her, and told the stunned guys, it's time to work. Dazzling lightning struck from the sky. It illuminated her smile. In a daze, the otakus from Jisha shivered and nodded like they were pounding garlic. Above the rolling thick fog, the violent thunderstorm lasted for 3 full days. Within 1,000 miles, all the earth energy was intercepted by Jisha's secret method. The poison and nutrients left in the Gaia fragments went into the dense forest. Lightning flashed from the dark clouds. Acid rain and lightning fell, illuminating the growing silhouette in the thick fog. On the last day, the weakening thundercloud struck the last bolt of lightning. There was an earth-shaking roar from the ground. In the raging torrent, withered branches like giant hands suddenly stretched out of the ground, parting the river water. They easily tore apart the dark clouds, pierced through the sky, and arrogantly and coldly stretched out their enormous bodies. After the lightning strike, a new clump of green quietly rose from the withered branches. Immediately after, countless leaves sprouted, revealing their radiance in the dissipating dark clouds. Amidst the violent tremors and loud noises that sounded like landslides, large amounts of mud and soil fell from the boiling mist. Meanwhile, even more lands and palaces were slowly coming to life. Above the giant trees' enormous body and roots, just like that, after defying the constraints of gravity and common sense, a new life was born in this ruined world. The enormous tree floated between the heavens and the earth. The crown of the tree glowed brightly. Life and death rotated in the turbulent origin substance. A rainbow light like the sun wrapped around it. Wherever it passed, the rivers boiled and water vapor rose into a storm, covering it. Soon, the storm silently dissipated with the movement of the branches and leaves. Although compared to Mount Tai, it is far from enough, but it is barely enough. Juju glanced at the wood patterns on his fingers and waved his hand without care. When the light of the brand new card descended from the sky, the roots of the giant tree violently extracted all that was left on the ground. In an instant, all the miracles within 10,000 miles were extracted, and the powerful and enormous body was rebuilt. Sun chasing wind treading Kwafu. After being reborn, he had completely forgotten his previous lesson. After discovering that he had recovered his full strength, he began to show off again. Such a big thing was planted by me? I knew it, old lady, I'm not ordinary. He couldn't help but slap his thigh and say proudly, "What do you mean by a white jade pillar that holds up the sky and a purple gold beam that holds up the sea?" "No, you're wrong." Juju pointed to the side and reminded him sympathetically, "That's what you planted." In the potted plant next to them, a withered tree had already withered and was dying. A breeze blew, and the withered leaves were all over the ground. It was almost dead. Kwafu's smile froze on his face. He couldn't accept such a tragic reality. "At least, the fruit is quite compatible with you. It is indeed biological." She casually caught the fruit that fell from the branch and tossed it to Kwafu. "Eat it yourself. Don't bother me if you have nothing to do." "No, then I only have this?" Kwafu lowered his head and looked at the withered fruit in his hand. He couldn't believe it and pointed to the giant tree under his feet. "But what is that? Didn't I tell you earlier?" Juju seemed to chuckle and replied indifferently, "This is nature." No longer subservient to the so-called world, the new nature hung high in the sky. Evergreen since ancient times. Miraculous imprint, Fuso. Oh, the breath of nature. I really miss it. Huai Shi lay on the edge of the cliff and looked at the rough wilderness below. Countless weathered rocks stood in the storm, but there were still shrubs and weeds growing out of the cracked soil. The sharp thorns and poisonous thorns showed the hatred and malice from the earth. What was more conspicuous was the machinery that was moving on the ground with billowing smoke. That was the construction team sent by the Eternal World Group. The huge and rough excavator emitted a harsh noise, digging the hills on the ground. Under the explosion of explosives, the huge skeleton hidden under the soil had been exposed. It was unknown what kind of giant beast it was in the past. At the top of the fossil, the skull like white jade was faintly glowing with brilliant light. "The blood of Gaia." Huai Shi whistled. He rubbed his hands excitedly. The time for another round of loot had arrived. Chapter 11:26. After such a long time, Huai Shi felt a little excited at the thought of being able to do the dirty work again. But on second thought, he was representing the reality realm, the righteous, bright, and great Astronomy Association. Next to him was Ing Fangzhou, the conscience of the utopia. How could it be considered a dirty work? This was a serious extermination of evil, the kind where everyone could work together without any psychological burden. Why would he need to follow the rules of the underworld when dealing with this group of evil people? Unfortunately, Ing Fangzhou was now seriously injured and could only sit in the back of the car to recuperate. He could no longer carry Huai Shi and Wushuang around. The two of them sped along. In order to avoid being pursued by Golden Dawn, Huai Shi drove nonstop for a full 3 days. From one end of the infernal realm to the other, they did not approach the reality realm at all. Those who relied on the mountain lived off the mountain, and those who relied on the river lived off the water. How could two ascendants of the celestial genealogy path think of leaving after coming to the infernal realm? They had burned, killed, and looted along the way, not leaving a single person alive. Not only had they gained a lot of supplies, but they had also repaired and upgraded their motorcycles twice. Now they had finally caught a big fish. What was this? This was a magical wishing machine, the crystallization of Gaia's miracles. Rounding it up, they could shake another person. This was a rare opportunity. Snatching it was a profit. On the map sent by the vice principal, the ivory tower's scope had already marked out all the locations of large-scale origin substance reactions, miracles, and disasters. It was not that they had not deliberately searched for them along the way, but there were some places where Huai Shi's premonition of death would jump non-stop when he approached, and some places had already been searched by the infernal realm's solidifiers and large groups. They had found nothing. It had been 4 or 5 days since the start of the war. 4 or 5 rounds had already passed in the outside world, and the easy ones had basically all been taken away. The ones left behind were all hard to chew. In the vast world of the fragment, the blood of Gaia was scattered all over the place. Some of the areas with particularly high concentrations had already been occupied. The rest of them were scattered in the wilderness and ruins, or they were hidden in unknown places, and had yet to be discovered. However, this was not a good rule. According to the law of alchemy, the greater the miracle and disaster, the easier it was to be attracted by the correction and distortion. Just like the little elves that players jokingly called Yaha in some games, they were often hidden in some ancient items or important places. Or, like the one in front of Huai Shi, they were buried deep in the remains of ferocious beasts that once ran rampant on the earth. Now, the entire excavation team was surrounding the huge skeleton, using all kinds of tools to try to disintegrate the snake-like hard bones. If it wasn't a huge drill or a hammer, the truck-sized skull wouldn't shake at all. When the explosives hit it, they could only break a small corner. He couldn't take it away, nor could he blow it up. It was as if a dog had stolen a can of food. He was about to go mad with anger. Just from what Huai Shi saw, the leader had already stomped to death 3 goblins that were in charge of drilling. Okay, now it was 4. What kind of bone is that? It's so awesome? Huai Shi scratched his head. Perhaps it's the remnant of the disaster that Gaia once created. In the back of the truck, Ying Fangzhou, who was covered in a blanket, raised his eyes slightly and glanced at it. Apart from natural disasters, the Discovery Realm also gave birth to many monsters. Among them, there were even some that were comparable to Grade 5. Later on, when the monsters were no longer useful, Gaia found another way. A new primate was born. What do you mean? Huai Shi was puzzled. In a literal sense, primates, a tool that replaced Gaia's destruction of the world, a species that replaced humans in the destruction of the world. A pure life form without a physical form. In the files of the Continuation Academy, it was called Brilliant Spirit, because when they appeared, their bodies were like some kind of element, made of fire, water, mist, or lightning. At that time, in order to exterminate such a species, the first generation of pioneers sank the entire British land, forming the 6 islands that are now. 1/5 of Europe became an uninhabited area. The headquarters of the Astronomical Society, the London border, was built on that battlefield. Ying Fangzhou didn't care about the confidentiality agreement that he had signed in the past. After all, he was already dead, so how could the confidentiality agreement control the dead? Moreover, the person in front of him wasn't an idler, but a genuine heir to the utopia. What was there to hide from the successor that he recognized? At that time, many brilliant spirits were taken away by the Continuation Academy as specimens to be preserved. In the future, you might be able to see them in the boxes of those mystics. It's all in the past, so there's no need to care about it. After Ying Fangzhou finished speaking, he raised his chin slightly and pointed to the distance below the cliff. As for the matter there, how do you plan to solve it? Either we sneak over and kill all of them, or we just openly rob them. What else is there to say? Huai Shi shook his head indifferently. Leave it to me this time. Senior, you just sit in the tent and support me remotely. Okay. Ying Fangzhou nodded. It seemed like he was praising him. Huai Shi got up, walked to the edge of the cliff, and looked down. He was still a little worried, so he turned around and reminded, "You must be careful. Don't fall asleep." "I got it," Ying Fangzhou replied impatiently. Huaisher nodded and climbed down the edge of the cliff. However, after taking 2 steps down, he couldn't help but stick his head out. We've agreed. Look for my signal. Ing Fangzhou didn't say anything and just looked at him coldly until Huaisher shrank his head back with a flattering smile. However, not long after, he stuck his head out again. Why don't get lost? Ing Fangzhou couldn't be bothered with him. He bent his left index finger and suddenly flicked it. With a soft sound, yin and yang stimulated each other, and the magnetic field transformed. Huaisher's entire body was like a cannonball, once again breaking through the wind pressure and catapulting out. After drawing a perfect arc, he smashed into the construction site of the excavation team with a thud. A cloud of dust rose. Dead silence. Only the goblin at the front screamed, "Who exploded? Who asked for it to explode? I just set off the explosion here." Before he finished speaking, someone impatiently pressed the detonation button. There was a loud boom. Flames shot up into the sky. The red-skinned monsters around them, covered in ferocious armor, had already raised the strange bone guns in their hands, or a mess of weapons. They aimed at the figure that fell from the sky. Immediately after, a terrified voice sounded. "Don't shoot, we're on the same side." A figure with his hands raised climbed up from the dust and walked out trembling. "Captain, don't shoot, it's me, it's me." Under the entanglement of countless strange flowers and weeds, Huaisher's face was completely different from before. After exchanging vitality with countless plants, it had already dried up and turned into wood. Its mouth was protruding, and its teeth were uneven. At first glance, it looked more like a kobold than a wood demon. At this moment, with a fawning smile on its face, it nodded and begged for mercy at the 8-armed armored robot in the middle of the enemy, which was constantly bursting under the steam. In front of the robot's chest, in the simple cockpit that was opened, there was a rat-man in a black suit and a monocle on its face. It looked at Huaisher from the corner of its eyes, and suspicion appeared on its face. It kept feeling that something was wrong. It should have killed him immediately, but this guy's smile was too kind, as if it had seen him somewhere before, and he looked very familiar. This made him unable to pull the trigger with his finger. It was a little hesitant. What if it was a mistake? "We're on the same side? You?" The rat-man stroked its beard and still did not let down its guard. It questioned, "Which department are you from? What kind of position is this? Why don't I see your work permit?" This. Huaisher was stunned for a moment before he saw that the launcher on the back of the huge robot was already aimed at him. He quickly replied, Wait, I'm not from Eternal World Group. There's a mistake. Where?" He stuttered for a long time before saying in a trembling voice, "Golden Dawn." There was a moment of silence. 100,000 question marks emerged from the heads of the goblins, the red monsters, the rat-man, and the surrounding operators. "Yes, Golden Dawn." Huaisher nodded vigorously and coughed twice. "About that, we're the military sympathy performance team sent by Golden Dawn." It was Mr. Woodman from above who considered that everyone was working too hard and could not relax, so he specially arranged a cultural performance. "Didn't you receive the notice?" After saying that, without waiting for the group of guys to react, he raised his hands and started twisting on his own. "Look, I also know how to dance Yanko. Dong cha, into the gods." The large group of people looked at the singing and dancing blossoming kobold and looked at each other. Although they did not know what he was talking about, it seemed that the twisting was quite interesting. Should they wait for him to finish twisting before killing him? Only the rat-man in the mecha pinched its beard and gradually frowned. In the midst of the coquettish dance, it seemed to have thought of something and suddenly shouted, "Huaisher!" In front of the long guns and short cannons, the spinning and jumping blossoming kobold subconsciously turned its head. It smiled brightly. "Hey!" Dead silence. In an instant, dead silence arrived. The rat-man's face in the cockpit had already turned red, green, and dark. It did not even notice that its precious beard, which was as precious as its life, had been pulled off. F*CK. You're the son of AB*TCH, who released the Sunmaker. The Ratman screamed furiously as if he had killed its father. It roared hoarsely. Kill him for me! What? Huaishur was stunned. Amidst the roar, it suddenly pulled the joystick all the way to the end. Thick black smoke spewed out from the buttocks of the 8-armed giant mecha. On the launcher on the back, hundreds of steam missiles were fired with ear-piercing whistles. Countless booms rang out, and the incessant explosions burned the ground into pitch black and crimson. But when the storm spread and the black smoke dissipated in the same place, there was a withered giant tree that rose from the ground in an instant. Under the entanglement and protection of layers of vines and strange flowers, a crack appeared in the middle of the tree bark, revealing the handsome face from the realm of discovery. Phew, I was scared to death. Huaishur wiped off his cold sweat. Fortunately, the poison has been used up. Before he finished speaking, the sound of people falling to the ground was heard one after another. Around him, the large group of monsters that rushed up suddenly screamed. Their movements quickly slowed down, and in the end, they almost stopped in place. Aging, disease, and even waxing. The mycelium parasitic in the lungs grew rapidly and drilled out of the mouth and nose. Together with the blisters and tumors, it quickly dressed the host as an artistic flower pot from hell. Then, everything quickly withered and decayed, turning into dust. Only the roar of heaven and earth erupted from the broken withered tree. A figure suddenly broke through the dense firepower like a rain of bullets. With a punch, it collided with the huge arm of the steam armor, wrestling with the mountain-like armor. He raised his head and smiled curiously at his opponent. By the way, what did you just say? Chapter 11:27. In the blink of an eye, everything had changed beyond recognition. A gentle breeze blew past, and all the subordinates fell to the ground one by one as if they were mowing grass. There was not even a sound. The armored Ratman widened his eyes and screamed as if he had lost his parents. My assets, those are all tools that I worked so hard to save up. Ahaf! The 8-armed iron fist held a drill, a sword, and a huge cannon. It kept smashing down on Huaishur, and the machine gun spat out tongues of fire. In the middle, it was accompanied by the Ratman's crazy shout. Die! Don't worry, it's nothing more than some worldly possessions. You can't bring them with you when you're born, and you can't bring them with you when you die. Why are you so worried? Besides, you're almost there. In the storm, Huaishur nimbly dodged left and right. He counted with his fingers. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. The moment his 5 fingers clenched into a fist, silence suddenly fell. In the cockpit of the steam armor, the Ratman widened his eyes in confusion and looked at Huaishur. Huaishur was also looking at him. The two of them looked at each other. However, nothing happened. Only the rotating machine gun aimed at Huaishur's dull face and spat out tongues of fire again. Die! 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 The Ratman shouted crazily, his eyes scarlet. I want you to die without a burial place! Wait, why haven't you fallen yet? Huaishur dodged the machine gun's fire in a sorry state, unable to understand. Fall? Why should I fall? The Ratman laughed sinisterly. The huge steam armor suddenly shook, releasing more steam. Thicker black smoke spewed out from behind its butt, and violent vibration waves spread out from its feet. Give up. It laughed proudly. With your market tactics that have no coupling at all, you can't break through our moat. It was as if the poison that was inhaled into his lungs did not exist. In that stooped body, even the bacteria could not germinate. At most, it made a few hairs fall off that face and add a piece of copper embroidery. Iron? Huaishur was stunned for a moment before he realized something. No, it's still flesh and blood. There's something wrong with this guy's body. My project, my promotion, my product, my future's investment, my position as the director of M4. Also, I have something to rely on for my comeback. It's all because of you, you bastard. The rat-orc screamed, his entire body emitting a strange heat. The temperature was as terrifying as a furnace, causing the steam armor to enter a state of overload. Under this indescribable anger and violence, he completely suppressed Huai-Shi. Die. The giant arm swept horizontally, and the armor caught him. When Huai-Shi hurriedly dodged, he was sent flying by the armor that suddenly rushed forward and smashed into the skeleton of the giant snake. His vision turned black. Then, he suddenly rolled, narrowly avoiding the drill bit's attack. Hey, don't slander a good person. Huai-Shi raised his hand in defense. I don't have any business in hell. You can't blame me for messing up the idol selection in hell. How can an idiot like you understand? The rat-orc roared angrily. Just a little more. Just a little bit more and I would have been able to complete the ecological precipitation with the support of the industry, connect the businesses of the various departments, and finally force the market to demand for the product. All of this was ruined by you and that bastard sun maker. Ruined. He was clearly speaking the human language, but the others couldn't understand a single word he was saying. Amidst the curses and murmurs that made one's vision turn black, the incomplete corpses on the ground actually got up again under the command of the armor's whistle. Like walking corpses, they approached Huai-Shi and attacked. In their hands, the bone guns in their hands fired randomly. The chaotic stray bullets were even more troublesome for Huai-Shi than aiming and shooting again. Furthermore, they were mumbling words like options, shares, dividends, and other hair-raising words. Their eyes were scarlet, hungry, and dull. You can even revive like this? Huai-Shi was dumbfounded. Aren't you guys going a little overboard? This is the cohesiveness and loyalty of our Eternal World group. The rat-orc raised his head proudly and announced in a loud voice, These are all outstanding employees who voluntarily lowered their salaries to share the company's joys and sorrows. What do you know? As long as they sign the agreement, they will be the company's tools while they are alive. After they die, they will also be the company's tools. Dead people. Under Huai-Shi's dull gaze, the steam armor suddenly stood still among the corpses and raised its 8 arms. Data transfer, project alignment. The rat-orc crossed his arms and shouted with his head held high. Ability bestowment begins. Accompanied by those impassioned and solemn words, all the walking corpses trembled violently. They made strange hee-hee sounds from their throats and twitched for a while. They were pulled and led by an invisible gravitational force toward the rat-orc. In midair, the corpses were shrouded in colorful lights. They spontaneously combusted without any fire. In the end, they formed strange bone parts that were embedded with each other. In the end, they covered the huge mecha. The moment the light dissipated, what appeared in front of Huai-Shi was no longer the original rough and cumbersome armor. Instead, it had become a giant rat-orc that was more than 10 meters tall and covered in layers of bones. On its ferocious face, layers of flames burned in its eye sockets. Now, the armored giant rat raised its sharp claws and pointed at Huai-Shi's face. I've already seen your user portrait clearly, Huai-Shi. You can't use the same tactic on our Eternal World group a second time. Today is the day you die. At this moment, in Huai-Shi's perception, the giant rat formed from bones and steel exuded a strange aura. It was like an invisible vortex, completely distorting reality and modifying it into what it wanted it to be. He had seen similar signs in other opponents before. Gaia's blood? It was too far off the mark. This guy, what kind of damned wish did he make with Gaia's blood? If that's the case, I don't need to pretend to be a gentleman anymore. Huai-Shi wiped the dust off his face and sneered. Suddenly, he raised a finger and shouted at the sky, Thunder, come! In that instant, the skeletal rat-orc's expression changed and it subconsciously took a step back. Silence. Nothing happened. In this sudden awkwardness, Huai-Shi turned around and looked behind him. He pointed at the sky again and shouted, "Thunder, come!" Silence. Still silence. Only the skeletal rat-orc looked at him blankly, not knowing what he was up to. Huaishur was stunned. As if he could not believe it, he pointed at the sky crazily. "Come! Come! Come!" However, there was no thunder. The sky was clear and there were no clouds for thousands of miles. Only Huaishur turned around again. With difficulty, he squeezed out an embarrassed expression at the giant rat. "Sorry, I was joking." He swallowed his saliva and raised his hand. "I think there's some misunderstanding here. I can explain." The giant rat did not speak. It just raised its arm. Between the layers of bones, a huge machine gun made of flesh and steel ejected. In the crazy rotation, countless bone cannonballs whistled out. Before he could cry, Huaishur covered his head and fled in a sorry state. A few kilometers away, on a cliff, in the back of the motorcycle, an old man covered in a blanket calmly lowered his eyes, as if he did not hear the screams and cries for help in the wind. Electric charges that could not be seen by the naked eye surged around him, jumping and forming a huge electric field. However, the killing intent that was not released had crossed dozens of kilometers and shrouded the visitor who was quietly approaching in the shadow. At that moment, the man who had just walked out of the shadow froze on the spot. He felt the bone-deep killing intent lurking around him. The faintly jumping light intertwined in front of him and turned into a thunder spear that was frozen in mid-air, ready to be fired. Then, a hoarse voice sounded in his ear. "Right there, don't move." Ing Fangzhou ordered coldly, slowly, "Raise your head and take off your hood. Let me see your face." "Why so serious, Mr. Ing? I just happened to pass by." The visitor seemed helpless. He slowly shrugged and raised his hands little by little. He took off his hood, revealing a bearded face and strands of pale red hair. Arthur Machen. The member from Golden Dawn nodded and smiled at the senior in the distance. "Why don't we all relax a little?" "Relax?" A sneer came in the wind. "You can completely relax." The moment all the thunderbolts were locked on, a mighty roar burst out in the clear sky. The light of the scorching sun dimmed. Without any warning, dozens of scorching thunderbolts fell from the sky. In the blink of an eye, all the shadows hidden in the surroundings were torn apart and burned to ashes. In the rising dust, Arthur's face slowly reassembled from nothingness. He shrugged helplessly. It was unknown whether he was regretting that his stalling tactic did not succeed, or regretting that this conversation was abruptly cut off. However, after knowing each other's killing intent, there was only one thing left. That was to kill without leaving any leeway. Just below Ing Fangzhou's feet, an ear-piercing scream came from the cliff. A huge mouth appeared out of thin air under the motorcycle and swallowed Ing Fangzhou into its stomach. But then, the huge mouth was torn apart again by the splashing water of hatred. In the back of the motorcycle, the heavily injured man disappeared in an instant. Thunderbolts swam and galloped in the sky. In the blink of an eye, it had already descended from the sky. Electric light burst out from its beard. Even though there was still a hole in its chest and only an arm remained, it was still so fierce that even the mountains could not block it. Wherever it passed, a crack was opened in everything. In the end, the sharp water pierced the cover of a pitch-black book. Behind the ancient book, the reassembled solidifier raised its head and smiled strangely. "As an alchemist, I really do not have the courage and ability to fight against you with weapons, so please allow me to present you with my humble work." Along with his words, the body that had just been reassembled welcomed another change. Curved goat horns grew from its forehead, its robe was torn, and its two hooves that were covered in hair stepped on the ground like a goat's feet. The human face was completely shrouded by the precipitation of hell, turning into the outline of a strange existence. In just an instant, surging divinity emerged from that mutated body, bestowing him with the power and body of a god. The record of events was unfolded here. The great god Pan. On the other side, Under the storm-like attacks and bombardments, the ground was already devastated. The huge bones that did not move under the bombardment of explosives were now showing cracks under the frenzied attacks of the skeletal giant rat. Not to mention the weak and helpless Huaishur, who could not even shake people. For the first time, he actually felt that in a battle, in terms of skills, he was suppressed by a ratman who had obviously never had any experience. It was as if all the counterattacks were within the opponent's plan. In just a moment of carelessness, his ankle was wrapped by a rope made of flesh and blood. It pulled him involuntarily into the air. The granularity is too high. How can a plan of this level escape our grasp? The skeletal giant rat cackled strangely, countless numbers flashing through its burning eyes. Finally, excitement appeared in an instant. Found it, your trigger! What's that? In midair, Huaishur's eyes widened. Immediately after, before he finished speaking, he felt the flesh and blood binding around his ankle suddenly emit a blazing light, and an endless amount of heat expanded within it. Some kind of intense qualitative change emerged from the source substance within. In the end, it triggered an explosion. A dazzling light swallowed everything. The flames spread, burning the ground below into a pitch-black color. Lava splashed and flowed in the storm. The skeletal giant rat threw its head back and laughed excitedly. It was like being engulfed by the terrifying power of a volcanic eruption, and all living things would be annihilated by this terrifying firepower. But in the gradually dissipating dust, hoarse coughs could be heard. At the very center of the explosion, on the charred ground, a crippled figure bent over, coughing violently and gasping for breath. On the bare bones of his right leg and foot, lines of wood appeared on the bones, and his flesh and blood slowly grew and reassembled. He no longer looked human. Instead, he looked more like hell. He was purely the incarnation of a mountain ghost. His messy hair tangled with each other, turning into withered branches that spread out. As layers of charred wood peeled off, new leaves and bark grew out from the gaps. The broken limbs and damaged organs quickly reassembled under the entanglement of the root. In the end, dozens of flexible tentacle-like vines extended from behind Huaishur. They spread out comfortably, absorbing the sunlight and spreading poison and vitality. I finally understand. The style of your eternal world group is to not speak human language, right? The mountain ghost raised his hand and scratched his wooden head, as if he was troubled. I originally planned to touch it for a while longer, slack off and slack off. I didn't want to let the old senior know that my progress was so fast. Huaishur sighed faintly and shrugged helplessly. Thanks to you, I'm going to be stuffed with new courses again. At that moment, an aura that made the rat orc's hair stand on end appeared from that strange face. Chapter 11:28. Huaishur was really not good at getting along with strict people. It was even more difficult to deal with someone like Fangzhou, who was square and old-fashioned and absolutely could not tolerate sand in his eyes. It was fine if the senior scoffed at him and felt that he could not be trained, but Fangzhou had greater confidence and expectations for Huaishur than he did for himself. Ever since he had been summoned, he had been making every second count, hoping that Huaishur would be able to improve even more, so that he could teach her everything he knew. Time was not on his side. If the conditions allowed, he would probably want to become some kind of system and hang on Huaishur, helping him to automatically train and increase his skill proficiency. Chicken. Give me a good chicken. From morning till night. 80 cram schools, and chickens would give birth to a bright future for a utopia. At the very least, he had to avoid making the same mistakes back then. As for the cause of his death back then, Fangzhou only had one conclusion. I'm not strong enough. Therefore, Huaishur, you must be stronger than me. As for how much stronger, it should be about 40 times stronger, right? Therefore, in order to ensure that she wouldn't be killed by Fangzhou's hell cram school, Huaishur tried her best to take a breather during the busy teaching process. She tried her best to lower her aptitude and expectations in Ying Fangzhou's heart. The ideal result was, of course, what? Other people's children can get a double score, but our child just passed? It doesn't matter, he's a retard. He's already worked very hard. However, Huai Shi also knew that this was unrealistic, but at least he could touch it for a while. He didn't skip class, so couldn't he slack off? Unfortunately, such a beautiful dream was completely destroyed by a rat man who came out of nowhere. It could be foreseen how tragic his life would be next. Do you know how miserable it is to practice purification from the moment you open your eyes in the morning until you close your eyes at night? Huai Shi sighed softly and raised his eyes. I finally stole a chicken. Why do people always want to snatch my eggs? A mournful howl burst forth. Behind him, the tentacle-like vines suddenly stretched out and grew wildly. In the blink of an eye, they crossed a distance of over 100 meters. From the sudden spike, the surface of the vines quickly hardened and turned pitch black, turning into a steel-like texture. Like the strings of a zither, it buzzed as if it was crying, tearing through the air. In an instant, it pierced through the skeletal giant rat's face, pierced through its eye sockets, and came out from the back of its head. What? In the instant that the ratman cried out in alarm, that strange face with wood grain was already right in front of him, and a creepy smile appeared on his face. Above the raised right arm, countless branches intertwined with each other, forming a giant fist that was like a hammer. The roots that had taken root in the soil pierced downwards once again. After they merged with the roar of the earth, they endlessly mobilized this silent power and placed it on the iron fist. Then they blasted out. Mastery, symphony. The roar of the earth separated from Huai Shi's right arm along with the vine iron fist and poured into the body of the ratman. In an instant, the skeletal armor was broken and exploded from the middle. In the midst of the debris, a large hole appeared. Black smoke and steam spewed out from it. The power that exceeded one's normal state did not have to worry about the resonance with a larger territory that would damage one's body. Instead, it released this power in a self-destructive way. Huai Shi had become the conductor of the sky and the earth. He wantonly released this terrifying power. That punch only peeled off a layer of skin from Huai Shi's right hand. But soon, under the spreading of vitality, the plants quickly grew back and healed. No more damage was done. Then, before he landed on the ground, he had already raised his right leg in midair. He kicked the skeletal giant rat's distorted face. Trample! In an instant, countless cracks appeared on the surface of the bones. The moat, the defensive measures, and everything else were completely destroyed by this pure brute force. The giant rat staggered backward. The autocannon in its hand was still spinning wildly, spewing out terrifying firepower. As if it was cheating, countless huge bone cannonballs flew in the air. In the end, they all whistled in the direction of Huai Shi. None of them missed. What responded to them was a sincere and righteous punch that was hurled forward. 3 thunderbolts. Skyfall. It was just a punch, but it stirred up a storm. Wherever the pale waves passed, all the cannonballs were crushed. The fragments flew backward and nailed on the giant rat's body like a rainstorm, tearing countless cracks. For the first time, Huai Shi felt every detail and change of the skyfall so clearly, and the final effect that it caused. The principle behind it was just a temporary release of the kinetic energy of the punch in the air. In a short distance, it spread out like a bomb, resulting in a terrifying effect as if the sky was collapsing. Only by really cheating to reach such a level, Huai Shi could deeply understand the meaning of the Sword Saint. This level was not even supreme. It was just skillful. Practice makes perfect. On the arm, the tragic cracks between the bones and the muscles quickly closed and disappeared. Instead, layers of scale-like leaves grew again. Under the premise that it did not affect the flexibility, it strengthened the hardness. The Achilles tendons of both legs were strengthened. Then, with an explosive power overload, you step. In the blink of an eye, the long distance was crossed. Huai was already in front of the giant rat once again. The vine hands behind him swung casually, pierced and tore apart the machine gun on the giant rat's arm. And among the countless scattered parts, the flame of the axe of wrath reignited. Slash! The sound of fate knocking on the giant rat's door flashed and disappeared. A deep crack appeared on the giant rat's chest. 4 cracks crisscrossed and broke the outer layer of defense. The spear of compassion was thrust forward. The giant rat's folded hands cracked in front of the spear. The speed of rebirth could not stop the damage, leaving a penetrating wound on the waist of the steam armor. That's it? That's it? It can't be, right? The mountain ghost laughed sinisterly and raised his hand to tear open the giant rat's shell. The vines behind him pierced in like a spear, wantonly destroying. Loud booms continued, and the rat man's tragic screams could no longer be heard. Now it was impossible to tell who was more like a monster. Even Huai himself was a little uncertain. Perhaps his current state could also be called purification, right? It was just a habit of opportunism and wanting to be lazy. Therefore, he hoped to solve the problem in a way that he was better at, and finally reached such a realm by accident. However, the aspect that Huai used was not his own complicated skills, but the pure single sacred mark in his body. The so-called focus was sometimes very troublesome for Huai, but sometimes it was actually very simple. It was enough as long as he played. So, on the other hand, why couldn't he use the skills that he used on the enemy himself? He also brought his own sacred mark into the control of Supreme. Catalyze. After breaking the balance between a second stage ascendant and a miracle, he deliberately caused the sacred mark to go out of control, and then transformed himself, approaching the mountain ghost without limit. In the end, he was able to break through the limit of his level and completely unleash his hidden power. 2 stages in advance, he achieved the origin substance mutation of his body. After swallowing all the vitality left by the heretic king in one breath, Huai body was now infinitely close to the original form of the sacred mark, and it was not an exaggeration to call him a real mountain ghost. Unfortunately, due to gender, he was not fated to have the beauty of the legends, and could only show the dark side of the mountain ghost. 100-year-old owl has become a wood ghost, and laughter rises from the jade fire nest. Huai tilted his head and looked at the giant rat's trembling face. Are you scared? Accompanied by his words, the sound of thunder in the distance struck again. A loud sound like the sound of mountains burst forth, spreading along the ground. Yun Zhongjuan's angry flames could be vaguely seen, as well as the battle and struggle on the other side. Senior, it's hard to be a bodyguard, and you're even injured. He sighed softly. Looks like I don't have time to play with you. Let's speed up. It was just as he said. Fast forward. In the blink of an eye, it was as if a long time had passed. The mountain ghost, who had been accumulating power in place, suddenly appeared in front of the enemy, enduring the flames and the bombardment of the bombs and mines. Branches grew on his raised arms, and once again, they turned into giant fists as hard as iron. They smashed down brazenly. The giant fists and armor exploded together, and the giant skeletal rat screamed and staggered back. Then, in Huai hand, the sword of virtue burst out with flames. Under the influence of the life force, the sword of dark green flames swept across, almost cutting the giant rat in half. The rat man screamed, "Align! Align all of you!" It widened its scarlet eyes and screamed. Suddenly, it reached out and forced the 2 halves of its body to join together. The broken bones gradually healed, and it returned to its original state. You can even put this together? Huai sighed. Your company's cohesion is extraordinary. How do you put it in your words? Ridiculous. The rat man roared angrily. I have long completed the content ecological closed loop after decentering. You, who happen to stand at the flow outlet, can't hurt me at all. Just wait for my link. That's enough. Huai shook his head and interrupted him uninterestedly. he asked straightforwardly. Is there any use in doing those fancy things all day long? The rat man was stunned for a moment. The moment he was stared at by the mountain ghost's cold gaze, a creepy chill crept up his body. Those messy words and titles are all smokescreens and cover-ups, right? Why sure impatiently exposed the disguise of magic. Your set of things is just a flawed version of the framework that is similar to the laws of the Creator through Gaia's blood. In essence, it's just forcefully turning other people into your things through agreements or contracts, right? In fact, you're just a winner after usurping other people's contributions and efforts. Huaisher sneered and told him, cohesion, loyalty, family. No matter how nice it sounds, once there are no other people in your framework, you're nothing. Well, other than being a joke. How dare you! An ear-piercing scream of madness and uncontrollable came from the stunned giant skeletal rat. Pitch-black smoke continuously spewed out from the gaps of the bones. Too much blood energy had dyed the smoke into a dazzling scarlet, as if it was burning. Amidst countless hoarse murmurs that were getting louder and louder, the 8 arms of the giant rat were surrounded by dazzling light. Like wind tunnels, they emitted an invisible suction force that distorted reality. The miracle created by Gaia's blood was now in its fist. I've decided, Huaisher. A hoarse voice came from the gaps of the giant skeletal rat, full of anger and resentment. Today, I'm going to use this combination of punches made for the ecology of hell to completely tear your stinky mouth apart. The mountain ghost grinned. It was as if he was disdainful. He stood where he was and only hooked his finger. Just like that, amidst the roaring of the giant skeletal rat's mad dash, Huaisher took half a step forward and bent down slightly. He took a deep breath. Resonance begin. At that moment, the lightning in the distance flashed, the earth trembled, the strong wind blew, and even the corpse that had been silent for many years behind him flashed like an illusion. There was a slight tremor. The invisible waves contracted inward. The closer they got, the more violent they became. In the end, they formed a pale wave in the air and converged on the mountain ghost's mutated fist. Huaisher closed his eyes. He listened to the vast sound that burst out from his body, towards the enemy, towards the front of him. One punch. At that moment, the rat-orc's roar, the roar of the armor, the sound of the siren, and even the loud thunderclap were all swallowed up by the invisible monster. Only the sound of cracking was left. From Huaisher's arm, cracks suddenly appeared, expanded, and spread. In the end, starting from his fingertips, half of his body shattered together. As for the remaining half, there were many deep cracks on it. However, soon, when blood seeped out, a brand new skin grew out from it, once again mending the incomplete body. However, after peeling off a layer of bark-like outer shell, Huaisher's appearance had returned to its original appearance. Thanks to the squandering just now, the vitality that had not been in the account for long was left with nothing. And right in front of him, in the strong wind, the last whimper of the skeletal rat dissipated with the flying ashes and disappeared. As the limbs and body collapsed, the entire armor began to evaporate at a speed visible to the naked eye, just like the market value of the company before it went bankrupt. Speaking of which, the sound just now was not art, nor was it a symphony. It was just rubbish noise after some random high-pitched sounds were piled together. Huaisher lowered his head and rubbed his wrist. He said casually, well, just think of it as renovation, which was specially created for you. Just like that, in the explosion of the renovation, the frame formed by the broken steel parts also collapsed. A rickety rat-orc fell out of it in a sorry state. It was still mumbling words such as track, link, sync, and other words that others could not understand at all. Impossible, impossible. How could my project be cut in half by you before it was released? It raised its head and screamed hysterically, Eternal World Group will never let you go. One day, you and that bitch Sunmaker will fall into a situation 100,000 times worse than mine. Definitely. Really? Huai Shi was surprised. Is there any job worse than being a tool for the Heavenly Literature Society? He did not care if the rat orc scolded or cursed him. It was just like how Eternal World Group loved to work overtime and contribute. No matter what happened, as a professional idol, his professionalism would never go offline. He had to do what he had to do, and he had to finish what he had to do. Now, Huai Shi held the axe in his hand tightly, aimed it at the rat orc's skull, and gestured slightly. "Watch me, splitting Mount Hua." With a muffled sound, the rat orc's scream of horror came to an abrupt end. In the dead silence, it lowered its head and saw a kick on its crotch. Its trembling legs could no longer support itself, and it knelt on the ground weakly. "Isn't it?" Splitting Mount Hua, it looked at Huai Shi in a daze. It made a squeaking sound and was about to cry. I did it backwards." Huai Shi scratched his head and comforted it. "Don't worry, I'll make it up for you." As he spoke, he stabilized it and raised the axe again. Splitting Mount Hua. Bang! Accompanied by the sound of something breaking, blood spurted out, and the head fell to the ground. It was still not split. Decapitated. Sorry. Huai Shi lowered his head and looked at the rat orc's desperate expression. He shrugged helplessly. It was convenient. In the pool of blood, the rat orc's lips opened and closed for the last time. It seemed to be cursing. Soon, it was covered by layers of flowers that grew out. Bursts of fragrance spread in the wind, making people feel relaxed and happy. When Huai Shi turned around and looked at the figure behind him, he smiled. "You're done so quickly? I was going to go and support you." "There's no need." Ing Fangzhou's beard was dyed scarlet, and his face was expressionless. Golden Dawn is getting worse and worse with each generation. They look decent, but once they start fighting with their lives, they become useless snacks. Huai Shi shrugged. He didn't know if he should agree or feel helpless. In any case, among the people he knew, in terms of fighting with their lives, there weren't many who could compete with the old senior himself. However, looking at Ing Fangzhou's gloomy expression, it didn't seem like he had won a great victory. "You didn't kill it?" he asked in confusion. Ing Fangzhou reached out expressionlessly and threw a tattered book out of his pocket. On the blood-stained and broken cover, one could vaguely make out the handwriting of Life's Broken Chapter. "There was something that could die for me. It ran away." He replied unhappily and glanced behind Huai Shi. He frowned. "But your opponent, why is he still alive?" "Yes, he's still alive." Huai Shi turned around and looked at the ground. "There's no rush. If you want to raise flowers, it's better to have a living one than a dead one. It's up to you." Ing Fangzhou withdrew his gaze and didn't look anymore. Instead, he raised his palm and pointed at the cracked head of the snake next to him. The sharp light that had been brewing in the celestial palace for a long time fell from the sky. In an instant, a straight crack appeared on the snake's skull. It penetrated through, and Ing Fangzhou's expression was slightly sluggish. He didn't expect that this thing couldn't be completely destroyed by his attack. Was it because the injury affected his performance, or was he really too old to be useful? He sighed faintly and reached out his hand. An invisible gravitational force pulled the glow of Gaia's blood out of it, shrank it into a ball, and threw it into Huai Shi's hand. "Have you thought about how to use it?" He supported dead water and sat on the ground. "It's a rare opportunity. Don't waste it, Huai Shi." "Don't worry, I've already thought about it." Huai Shi smiled slightly, lowered his head, and stared at the phantom light rising from his fingertips. "What do you want, Huai Shi?" That kind of hallucinatory question rang in Huai Shi's ears again. He looked back, glanced at the severely injured senior, sighed softly, and made a wish. "Please, someone who can cure Ing Fangzhou can cure him in any sense. It's best to have a healer," Huai Shi finally added. At that moment, a dazzling light erupted from his hand and suddenly soared into the sky. Countless scenes flowed out from the Book of Destiny and gathered at Huai Shi's fingertips, reproducing a member on the former catalogue. An ancient book full of vicissitudes appeared in Huai Shi's hand. Then, it left his hand and unfolded. Countless pages flipped, forming the outline of the former card. Amidst the sandstorm, a pair of dirt-stained leather boots stepped on the flowers planted by Sephora. The various tools and ropes hanging from the backpack around his waist swayed slightly. The old Hell explorer raised his head and looked at the world in front of him again. In the dead silence, Huai Shi stared blankly with his eyes wide open. Really, there's a healer? After a long time, he subconsciously bent down and bowed with his hand on his chest. Long time no see, Miss Chashel. Chapter 11:29. At this moment it was in the flying yellow sand. In the silence, old Madame Evelyn's eyes moved slightly, as if she had just woken up from a long sleep. However, there was no confusion or bewilderment in his eyes. The moment she saw Huai Shi, her eyelids lifted slightly. Is it you? Evelyn suddenly sighed softly. I see. She seemed to have understood something at that moment, but she was not so shocked and did not say anything. She lowered her head and sniffed the tobacco in the jar. Then she stuffed it into the pipe slowly. Finally, she said softly, You really played a trick under my nose. Sensing the hidden meaning behind his words, Huai Shi subconsciously shrank back a little, wanting to defend herself. The reason is really hard to explain in a few words. It doesn't matter. Anyway, I'm dead, and the living have nothing to do with me. Instead, you have to work harder. Evelyn tilted her head, inhaled, lit the pipe, and slowly exhaled a wisp of smoke. Suddenly, she asked, Is she all right? She. Huai Shi was stunned. Then, he realized that the line of sight behind the smoke had suddenly become sharp. It was like a knife pointing at the scumbag. It was shining brightly. Huai Shi involuntarily straightened his back and answered in a trembling voice, Thank you for taking care of me. I'm eating well and sleeping well. Evelyn nodded slightly and then asked, What about her? In a short silence, Huai Shi wiped the cold sweat on his forehead and smiled flatteringly, She's the same. She's the same. Evelyn's sigh became meaningful again, which made Huai Shi tremble more and more under the gaze. But in the end, the old madam suddenly smiled. As for that one, I won't ask. Evelyn took the pipe from the corner of her mouth and sighed with relief. Since you can still be alive and kicking, she should be better, right? She's eating better and sleeping longer. He wiped his sweat and carefully answered the old lady's question. It's not a small good, it's a big good. His heart that had just risen had already sunk to the bottom of the valley. He was about to burst into tears. Now, all he wanted was to find a hole in the ground to hide in, or give him a rope to hang himself. Why didn't he think of that? If someone could even take care of Fangzhou, why couldn't they take care of him? He had just gotten a father, and now he had gotten a grandmother. Furthermore, she was a super combat granny who could climb mountains of blades and descend into hell. She was capable of researching the elements of destruction and could be a violent archaeologist in hell. She had been all-powerful when she was alive, and even after she died, the entire world would mourn for her. There was no way to continue living. The only thing he could do now was to divert the old lady's attention and offer his senior as a scapegoat. Thinking of this, Huai Shi took a big step back and pointed at his teammate next to him. He said in a loud voice, Don't worry about me. Take a look, Senior Ing is injured. His blood is all over the ground. At the side, Fangzhou, who had been silent from the beginning, stiffened and turned to glare at Huai Shi. Then, he heard Evelyn's voice. Is it little Ing? The old lady raised her eyebrows slightly and scrutinized the gray-haired man in front of her. You haven't spoken for so long. I thought you were a subject to be sent to a general anatomy class. What's wrong? You don't want to greet me? After a short silence, Fangzhou no longer had any arrogance. He bowed his head respectfully. I'm just ashamed, Professor. Such a serious injury? Chachel raised his hand and casually lifted Ing Fangzhou's clothes. He scrutinized the tragic traces below. What happened? Did you bump into the muzzle of some ruler again? I was punched by the heretic king, Ing Fangzhou answered truthfully. You guys from the Heaven's Inquisition faction, more or less, have some problems with your brains. It's fine if you're just a support, but when you're hot-headed, you rely on your tough life to do whatever you want. The only one with a clear mind is a good-for-nothing who can't be helped up. From top to bottom, you've never been a good person. The old lady stretched out her hand mercilessly and tore open the wound on Ing Fangzhou's chest. She observed the injuries inside. Finally, she coldly withdrew her finger and took out a handkerchief to wipe the blood. She said mercilessly, "If you can learn even one word of the cautiousness that I taught you back then, you won't die in front of me, your teacher." Ing Fangzhou lowered his head and nodded respectfully. Yes. Seeing that he was being reprimanded by the old lady and did not dare to talk back, Huaishe could not help but cover his face and restrain himself from laughing out loud. Old Ing, you also have a day like this. Feel this pain." But before he could gloat for a while, he saw the old lady turn around and glance at him. "What are you laughing at? You're not much better. There's no difference between 1 or 2. Even if you bring them to class in the future, they can only be used as a negative example for the students. One died recklessly, the other died recklessly. None of them had a good ending. As a teacher, you might feel embarrassed and not even be willing to attend the funeral." Huaishe smiled stiffly and did not dare to speak. Even if he was beaten, he had to stand upright. Moreover, the old lady was right to teach him a lesson. Forget it. He's already dead. There's no need to make a fuss in front of the young people. Evelyn sighed and reached out to press on the wound on Ing Fangzhou's chest. "I'll say the ugly words first. Other than first aid, the only thing I can use is a little bit of biological law. You'd better be prepared. Please do not worry." Ing Fangzhou nodded in response. "No, what I mean is, injuries are nothing to worry about. It's just that, as a teacher's occupational disease, I always want the students to remember the lesson, so—" She thought for a moment and smiled. "The process will be a little painful." At that moment, the painful education began. Ing Fangzhou suddenly widened his eyes. His body twitched violently, the veins on his face bulged, and his teeth cracked. He could not suppress the painful roar in his throat. He roared loudly. Blazing light burst out from his body and spread in the roar. The wandering electric light raged and swept through. It was difficult to control. The remaining supreme power in the wound lost its suppression and exploded. Just like that, in front of Huaishe, Ing Fangzhou's body exploded into a mist of blood. Not even a fingernail-sized fragment could be found. However, before he could react, he saw the surging blood mist rapidly shrinking inwards. Pale bones, nerve lines, wriggling blood vessels, and the outline of internal organs quickly appeared. In the end, a naked man knelt on the ground in the broken water sack, staggering and panting. His fingers trembled uncontrollably. However, the arm that was once torn apart was finally back. The big hole in his chest was also repaired and restored to a complete state. There were no internal injuries left behind the old lady. Huaishe's eyes twitched, and he felt a chill on his back. He just wanted to take a few breaths of oxygen and calm down. He had never seen such a violent treatment method. Since the injury caused by the heretic king was difficult to heal, he would completely detonate the power that was suppressed by Yun Zhongjuan in the wound. Then, before it killed Ing Fangzhou, he would take the first step and tear Ing Fangzhou into pieces. It would be like cutting him into pieces, leaving no room for destruction. After the supreme power dissipated, he would be put back together again through the framework of the Creator. He would also collect other tissues and cultivate the missing bones and internal organs. Anyway, as long as the soul was fine, this kind of damage was not a problem for Yun Zhongjuan. For a short time, you will be weak for a while. Lie down first. Cha-Cha took out a set of clothes from her satchel and threw it over. Then, she took out a folding chair and opened it before looking at Huaishur. Since we can appear here, it means that the gambling game has started again. The old lady asked, "Who is the chess player?" "It's me, Madame Cha-Cha." The voice of the vice principal was heard. He suppressed his excitement and reported solemnly, "The 19th trial of the Sacred Heart, Isaac." From the Divine Marrow series? Evelyn was slightly surprised. She nodded and said, "Katia has mentioned you to me. I didn't expect that you would grow to this point so quickly." "I'm just relying on the senior's help," the vice principal replied. "The only thing different from your godmother is your modesty." She shook her head and sighed. "Since you can appear here, it means that the celestial genealogy has begun to rebuild." The old lady looked at Huaishur and asked, "Who is in charge now?" "Russell." Huaishur answered without hesitation. Silence. In a short silence, the old lady seemed to be stunned. Evening Fangzhou, who was lying on the ground, suddenly sat up and raised his eyebrows. Who are you talking about? That candidate for the clerk?" "Russell." Huaishur answered again, "That's the guy you know." This time, Evening Fangzhou was dumbfounded. He and Evelyn looked at each other. It felt as if after Oda Nobunaga came back to life, he sat cross-legged with Toyotomi Hideyoshi and discovered that in the end, it was Tokugawa Ieyasu who forced him to take over the world. They felt the pleasant surprise from fate. "I always feel that life is full of setbacks and that the future is bleak." After a long time, the old lady sighed softly. "I think this utopia is finished." "To be honest, I think so too." Huaishur nodded frantically in agreement. If not for the fact that the conditions did not allow him to do so, he would have immediately started saying things like Russell is going against the flow and provoking complaints from the celestial genealogy, and the world is full of bitter old bastards. Then, he would have returned to the two sages and returned to the ivory tower. When the time came, the old lady would be the master of the genealogy and old Ing would be the #1 tool. Everyone would rebuild the second utopia together. Wouldn't that be perfect? However, they probably would not take these jokes seriously. After lamenting for a short while about the fickleness of fate, the old lady did not care too much. "Who initiated the bet?" Evelyn finally asked. "Li Qing? Marcus? Or Olaf?" "It's me." The hoarse voice of the diplomat came from outside the chessboard. "It's good to see you, Professor Chachel. You're actually still alive, Marcus." Evelyn was silent for a long time and sighed with pity. "It's been so many years. It's been hard on you." "It's just part of my job," Marcus replied as if he was smiling. "There's always a mission, Professor. Don't talk about missions to people who are still dragged out to work after death." Evelyn shook her head and sighed with emotion, but did not say anything else. After understanding the situation in detail, she began to organize the tools and reserves in her backpack. Soon, she finished counting, but she did not find any materials that she had previously stored. She could only get up from the chair and look around. Under the wind and sand there was a pale and ancient skeleton. There were also small protrusions that had long been covered by layers of flowers and plant. "Whose is this?" she asked. "It's quite unique." Huaishur raised his hand. "Do you mind letting me use it?" the old man asked. "I need some materials." "Do as you wish." Huaishur did not care. "Do you need me to take off these things that are in the way?" "No need. This is fine." Evelyn lowered her eyes and stared at the grassland full of flowers and plants under her feet. She did not care about the poisonous powders spreading in the air. She just suddenly reached out and enveloped the dying ratman in the distance. She clenched her 5 fingers. At that moment, a faint light surged from the void and enveloped the entire area. The framework belonging to the Creator descended. Chapter 1130. Looking at it with the naked eye, it was impossible to tell the difference between the changes. But in the eyes of the soul of the Ascended, all of this had undergone earth-shattering changes and reversals according to the will of the Creator. It was not a problem to call it a taste, an aura, or some other feeling. The key was that the space in the two places had become completely different. It was as if there was suddenly a patch of darkness in the red ink, a hole that led to the deepest part of the trench appeared in the blue ocean, and a ray of sunlight appeared in the pouring rain. The laws that were completely different from Gaia's laws were at work here. Then, there was a miraculous phenomenon. In just a few seconds, countless grass and flowers rapidly shrank. It was as if time had reversed. The brilliant stage of blooming quickly went back, and was no longer there. The vitality that overflowed within flowed and began to shrink. In some way that Huai Shi could not understand, it returned to the dying Ratman on the ground. Then, the Ratman that had been beheaded by Huai Shi let out a blood-curdling scream. The head that was severed on the ground quickly changed. It was like plasticine that had been flattened and molded as it was molded according to one's will. Sometimes it turned into the appearance of a kobold, and sometimes it turned into a middle-aged, shriveled face that resembled a human. Finally, it returned to its original state. The neck and body were once again connected together in an incredible manner. It floated in the air and spasmed violently under the operation of the laws within the framework. The stooped body began to expand. Tentacles, blisters, tumors, and mutations on the body constantly appeared and quickly disappeared. All abnormalities and byproducts were disintegrated under the stripping and suppression of the Creator. In this bizarre change, the Ratman spasmed violently and suddenly raised its head. On its spasming face, there was a faint, magnificent color surging between its mouth and nose. A familiar aura spread out, making Huai Shi come closer in disbelief and widen his eyes. The blood of Gaia. What is this? He pointed at the Ratman and asked in a daze, "What's going on?" Of course, it's the theory of evolution. Evelyn's 5 fingers moved slightly, precisely adjusting the laws of every place, controlling all the changes. She could still divert some of her attention to teach the ignorant juniors, so she had plenty of time to spare. "What do you think the framework is, Huai Shi?" she suddenly asked. Huai Shi was speechless for a moment. Although he had some understanding of the relevant concepts, he suddenly realized that he didn't know how to give a precise definition. "A creation mode for cheating?" he answered tentatively. "Although it's a little off, it's not too far off." Evelyn nodded and explained calmly, "Scholars, at the end of the day, are people who operate and write laws. It's not a problem to be a programmer who maintains the reality system. After the passing of the gods, this was the new era of magicians, learning laws, compiling laws, and modifying laws. Through the medium of reality, he could finally control the 4 seasons, regulate ocean currents, pacify earthquakes, and extinguish lava. However, success was limited by the present situation. Once he left the present situation, the effect of a single law would be greatly reduced, and he would even have to rely on other tools to operate. Under such circumstances, a framework that could replace the existence of the present situation and make the laws self-consistent in it was born. The so-called framework was made by imitating the structure of the present situation. It was a system that could operate independently even after leaving the present situation. Every creator had their own field of expertise. In the end, what was achieved was a unique system and framework. Not only that, it could be called a domain or a creation mode. Whether its structure was complicated and precise or simple and straightforward, the framework itself was a modification tool made by countless laws under the main axis of the Creator. Its only function was to modify reality. At this point, the old lady's smile became more and more amiable. As long as it was within the scope of its own specialty, it could be modified however it wanted. At that moment, the Ratman's ear-piercing scream reached its peak. In that dilapidated and hunched body, a dazzling and magnificent light reappeared. Huai Shi, What you saw was the reverse application of the theory of evolution. Evelyn said softly. The theory of degeneration. Now, the final degeneration had begun. Under the will of the Creator, the Ratman's state reversed time and traced back to the past at a rapid speed. The new cells were rapidly shrinking, and the old cells were recovering from death. Version rewind. Forcefully rewind back to before it used the blood of Gaia. The magnificent brilliance of the blood of Gaia was finally completely extracted from its body and fell into Evelyn's hands. The moment it was completed, the Ratman, who could not bear the burden, met its end after leaving the framework. It turned into ashes and disappeared without a trace. This. Huaishur was dumbfounded. Can it be done like this? He suddenly had a bold idea. Oh, I see. The essence of the miracles left behind by the old world? After a simple glance, the old lady had already analyzed the object in her hands thoroughly. It's not a problem to say that it's the blood of Gaia. It's also mixed with a derivative of the spirit marrow pillar. The pillar is a fragment stripped from the creation plan? After analyzing it, she glanced at Huaishur. Don't look at it. Although the theory of degeneration, you can strip it out, in essence, this thing has already been used. The state is solidified, and there is no possibility of reconstruction. With that said, she tossed the blood of Gaia that had shrunk into a block in her hand. However, as a polymer of miracles like the crystal of wishes, it can still be used for the time being. After pondering for a moment, she raised her eyes again. She looked at Huaishur. The look in her eyes was so subtle that it made Huaishur feel a chill at the back of his head. The premonition of death suddenly jumped. Huaishur, you should have other cards, right? Evelyn suddenly asked. Huaishur was stunned. My legs are not good. After getting old, I'll pant after taking 2 steps. I always need a means of transportation. Evelyn said slowly, coincidentally, you're here. It saves me the trouble of finding other raw materials. When she said this, her eyes stared straight at Huaishur. Her expression was so solemn. At the same time, it was meaningful. Just like the Bodhisattva in the TV series, standing on the cloud with a jade bottle, looking down at the sprite running out of her garage with a mysterious smile. At this point, there was no need to say more. Evil creature, why don't you show your true form? At that moment, Huaishur finally understood what she meant. He subconsciously took 2 steps back, raised his hand, and tried to stop her. Wait, but just as he opened his mouth, the sound that came out of his mouth became a confused syllable. Woof! The familiar electronic accompaniment sounded involuntarily in his mind. Huaishur felt his body rapidly expanding under the framework of the Lord of Creation. Layers of hair quickly grew from his skin without any resistance or discomfort. It evolved smoothly in the direction of hell. Under the blessing of theory of evolution, his appearance changed in an instant. And when the crystal in the hands of the Lord of Creation was thrown out, he involuntarily looked up to the sky and howled. In the familiar howl, he swallowed the crystal of Gaia's blood in one gulp. Then, dazzling electric light burst out from his limbs. The dazzling light spread, and the hair fell off, turning into hard black scales. When they rubbed against each other, sparks burst out. When the huge body expanded again, it cast the ferocious outline of the demonic dragon of the past on the ground. In the end, the behemoth with a body length of hundreds of meters opened its mouth and swallowed the bones of the giant snake next to it. The 2 sharp horns on the top of its head grew rapidly. Like a wolf and a dragon, the back of the majestic behemoth swelled, and the shadow of a huge pair of wings appeared faintly. They overlapped with each other and turned from illusion to reality, forming a huge light wheel. Now, the young man just now had turned into a behemoth that could swallow the sky and the earth. Huaishur's beast, super evolution. With the blood of Gaia, the Lord of Creation, a cycle was summoned. Then, the Prince of Paradise, Huaishur, was sacrificed, and this solidified miracle crystal was thrown in to complete the final summon. End Behemoth Bichimos, infant. At this moment, a bright golden light emerged from the surface of the card on the chessboard. The dual attributes of resources and creatures appeared unbelievably, and the attack and defense values began to skyrocket at a jaw-dropping speed. Just like a super-large war weapon. The behemoth that was comparable to a building roared at the sky above the card, and layers of lightning burst out. Everyone's eyelids twitched crazily at the sight of the two innate skills that were vague and vague. Death Devourer. All death is its food. Devouring hell creatures will allow the beast of heaven to grow. Life Devourer. All living things are sacrifices to the End Behemoth. Consuming souls will allow the End Behemoth's divinity to transform. In the end, all that was left was the description of the card, which was short and confusing. There were only 2 words. Holy! The majestic halo behind the behemoth once again resounded with familiar hymns and praises, vast and majestic, resounding throughout the world. And when the flowing light of the card once again descended from the sky, surging origin substances and miracles emerged from the halo of the behemoth, converging into one and condensing again to reforge a brand new physical body. All Ages Card Commemorative Pack. Pack Sale to the Stars of Rotten Dreams. Judge, descend here. And when Huai Shi returned again with the help of the second card, what he saw was the behemoth that was as large as a building lying on the ground, wagging its tongue and tail, flattering the creator. Is this reasonable? He scratched his head. Why didn't he know that he had this ability? It was a pity that Bichimos was ultimately a behemoth of hell created by the combined efforts of 2 creators. Although it was the manifestation of Huai Shi's bestial nature and manifested the changes after his solidification, Huai Shi's soul was still in a sublimated state and could not be completely transformed. He could only abandon the Prince of Paradise form and return with another card. Otherwise, wouldn't he be able to transform into a big monster again and continue to spit out happily? How else could it be said that having an old person at home was like having a treasure? The older the person, the more precious. Unlike Senior Ing, who was a golden thigh when it came to fighting, the moment old Lady Chachel appeared, the car and house were immediately settled. Now, under the command of the old lady, Ing Fangzhou had already begun to install the base of his celestial palace on the back of the behemoth. Soon, the projection of the majestic celestial palace appeared on the back of the behemoth. Boundless lightning rose, layers of dark clouds gathered out of thin air, rain and thick fog fell, shrouding the behemoth's surroundings. With this as the foundation, a new cycle of the 4 seasons was formed. Thunder spread. Apart from the research on hell creatures and the theory of evolution, other things are not my area of expertise, old Lady Chachel sighed. Apart from protecting this big guy, I'm afraid it's hard for me to be distracted in other aspects. Little Ing has no talent in other aspects apart from fighting. What do you plan to do next, Huai Shi? Do you still need to ask? Huai Shi lowered his head and looked at the markings on the map in his hand, as well as the dozens of strongholds that represented the Golden Dawn. Let's go and greet our acquaintances. He smiled at the chessboard and whispered softly, I miss them so much. Chapter 1131. Above the vast snowfield, thunder suddenly sounded in the distance. Countless mounds were covered in flying snow, like the gums of ferocious beasts, surrounding and protecting the castle that was shrouded in brilliant rainbow light. And under the snow-covered ground, countless root-like tissues spread out from the bottom of the castle. The alchemy array from the Golden Dawn was slowly growing, covering the land inch by inch, correcting the depth, changing the weather, and reshaping the universe, recreating the dead snowfield, little by little dragging it into hell. Those sharp ice crystals that grew from the ground gradually emerged dark projections. With the condensation of disaster, a large group of plants from hell were brewing in the countless ice beds. Occasionally, there would be precocious individuals that would suddenly open their blood-red eyes across the ice layer. They would look at this world. Then, they would find that the amber world was also looking down at them. It even blinked. Curiosity appeared in its vertical pupils. Then, a huge palm gently pressed down across the thick layer of ice. Its sharp claws popped out like blades, deeply embedded into the ice layer, cutting and crushing it. Finally, it raised its claws and licked the remaining ketchup on it twice. After spitting, the behemoth withdrew its gaze and continued to wag its tail and lick its tongue, galloping happily in the snow. Towards the distance, in the castle shrouded in rainbow light, between the layers of arrays of the arcane array, a thin figure suddenly appeared. Mr. Waite. Surrounded by the arcane array, the alchemist raised his eyes. It's rare to see you in such a hurry. Do you have any orders? Edward Waite was silent for a moment and sighed. Mr. G, I'm sorry to bring you bad news. This place is abandoned. Everyone must evacuate as soon as possible. I will assist you. What? Ji Shangu was slightly stunned and frowned. The zombie vesicles have just been planted and we have to evacuate now? There are enemies coming. Edward sighed. We need to buy more time and mobilize the surrounding forces. Before that, we must avoid unnecessary losses. Who? Ji Shangu's mind turned quickly. The map of the surrounding area and the division of forces appeared in his mind. He found it hard to believe. 6 layers of Rashomon defense lines can't hold? Is Rome that fast? Not Rome. After a short pause, whether it was an illusion or not, Edward revealed an expression, as if he had eaten sh*t. He said, it was why sure. For a moment, not only Ji Shangu, but even Doppler, who had rushed over from the outer layer, was stunned. Due to the limited environment, they were unable to pay attention to the changes in the outside world. However, the last time they received news, it was when Alistair directly used the Heretic King to suppress the rising stars of celestial genealogy. Who would have thought that even the heretic monarch would be defeated? Please wait a moment. Ji Shangu nodded without hesitation and commanded his androids to start packing up all the experimental data and matrix data, as well as important instruments. As a new member of the Inner Circle after the fall of the Kingdom of Heaven, he had already reached the rank of the Crown Wearer in just a short dozen years after the solidification. He was given the honor of the Abyss Infant, and was expected to advance to the Third Circle within 100 years and become the ruler. However, this did not mean that he would act recklessly, and it was impossible for him to be so arrogant that he was not afraid of anything. As an alchemist, he did not have the intention to wrestle with the sword of calamity of celestial genealogy. It was not shameful to run away, but it would be foolish to be chopped to death. There were already 2 grandmasters who had died in his hands, and he did not need to add to the list. In less than 3 minutes, all the relics and important secret ritual cores that were scattered around the area had been collected into the bag. After abandoning the large group of people around them, Ji Shangu, Doppler, and the other solidifiers had already gathered in the atrium that was full of flying snow. In Edward's hand, the glow of the card appeared again. However, it was completely different from the vast majority of alchemy. After going deep into hell, the former members of the Kingdom of Heaven had already excavated and explored a completely different way of using alchemy from the Utopia. As the essence of alchemy gathered, a gray card appeared on his palm. The man in red held a double-headed scepter in his hand, and his crown had an emblem that represented infinity. He was showing a miracle to the witnesses in front of him. Following the reversal of the card's surface, there was a faint outline of a monkey behind him, hinting at the secret hidden behind the miracle and the scam that no one knew about. Tarot card, magician, mystery, ingenuity, and even ingenuity and cunning. All kinds of meanings surged, and in the end, the solidified divinity turned into a solemn projection. Holding the mercury staff with 2 snakes entangled in it, and stepping on the flying boots, Hermes's divine power descended under the call of the secret instrument. In the blink of an eye, a straight path was opened up from the layers of snowstorm. At the end of the path that shone with rainbow light, the distant place that was isolated from the world was already close at hand. The moment they stepped on the path, their figures suddenly disappeared from the courtyard, turning into streams of light that flew into the distance. But at that moment, the flying snow that filled the sky suddenly stopped. A gloomy aura suddenly pressed down from the grayish-black sky, and the ice-cold aura that seemed to have substance turned into an iron clamp, causing the magician's teleportation to stop. Then, the dome shook violently. The heavenly drum burst forth, and the mighty thunder spread, shaking heaven and earth. Scorching pain. The tens of thousands of lightning bolts had already slashed down from the clouds. In an instant, they crossed a long distance and slashed down on the path of rainbow light. The tyrannical light spread, and the magician's phantom dissipated in an instant. Their figures were awkwardly squeezed out from the void, and then they saw the figure that blocked their path. Without any warning, he descended from the sky. "Where are you going?" Ing Fangzhou raised his eyes and coldly glanced at the enemy in front of him. In his arms, the hateful water spear rang loudly. Under the grip of that hand, the spear tip cut across the ground, drawing a straight line from the end of the line of sight to the other end. It was like an invisible iron wall that rose from the ground. "The battle between us hasn't started yet," he calmly ordered, "so you have to go back." Edward frowned, and the tarot card projection in his hand appeared again. He raised his voice and questioned, "Ing Fangzhou, you boom?" Before his voice died away, the dazzling lightning bolts went straight forward. The soul-shaking thunder spread, tearing the air and ravaging everyone's eardrums. Yun Zhongjuan's lightning spear had already arrived. "Or, let's just," Ing Fangzhou grinned and whispered in the ear of his enemy, "die here." At that moment, Edward only had time to flip his hand, take out a golden cup, and throw it at the lightning bolts in front of him. The lightning bolts all over the sky turned into a waterfall and poured into the cup, but there was no overflow. It seemed to be bottomless. Then, the outline of a sword appeared in his hand. It was cast by the dazzling lightning bolts just now. He threw it at Ing Fangzhou, but it only provoked a sneer. The lightning bolts bombarded Ing Fangzhou's body, but they couldn't cause any damage. Then, the lightning bolts that had been purified 3 times appeared on the blade of the spear and stabbed out. Under that spear, Edward was vaporized into ashes without any resistance. But the moment just now had allowed him to be prepared. Soon, his body reappeared in the distance, but one of the tarot cards in his hand was missing. In just one move, the fool was destroyed. His expression became gloomy. "Do you think everyone will go easy on you? Old thing, don't be too presumptuous. Then come and kill me." Ing Fangzhou dragged the lightning spear and stepped forward step by step, not caring at all. His body, which was shrouded in layers of lightning, was difficult to see with the naked eye. But the ferocious smile on his face was so clear. "Let me see how much you trash have learned from hell." In the blink of an eye, lightning bolts fell from the sky. Yun Zhongjuan had turned into countless afterimages and rushed toward Edward. The brilliance of the hermit, a temperance, and a star kept appearing one after another. At this moment, the world on the snowfield seemed to have suddenly turned upside down, and everyone felt a strange sense of weightlessness. Everything was separated from each other, and Edward's figure disappeared without a trace in an instant. When he reappeared, brilliant flames had already gushed out from his body. The battle between the solidifier and Yun Zhongjuan began in an instant. The terrifying aftermath swept across, and there was no place for the others to stay. But before that, a magnificent flash shrouded the rest of the people, wrapped them up, and flew back to the castle again. In the dead silence, everyone looked at each other. Even if it was just a short moment, the killing intent from Yun Zhongjuan was like a knife, deeply piercing into their souls, making everyone tremble involuntarily. the hatred and ferocity that almost condensed into a substance. Which side is the solidifier? Ji Shanggu covered his face. Cold sweat flowed silently between his twitching fingers. It was not only fear and Yun Zhongjuan's destruction, but also the feedback from the array. Outside the castle, a ferocious outline gradually emerged in the wind and snow. The earth was rumbling. Under the trampling of a behemoth, a solemn light wheel lit up in the layers of wind and snow, and a mighty hymn played between the frozen world. The enemy was close at hand. At that moment the solidifier looked at each other, and the ferocity and hostility from hell appeared in their eyes. They would never sit and wait for death. Awaken the giant elephant. Ji Shanggu clenched his fists and squeezed out a voice from his throat. They want war. Then give them war. The array roared, and the disaster created in the furnace roared. It condensed and took shape in the wind and snow. Didn't we agree to go into the dungeon together? On top of Bichimo's head, Huaishir looked at the clouds that kept falling in the distance, and sighed helplessly. Why did you go up and start the fight alone? Although he complained, he still understood Ing Fangzhou. Seeing that Golden Dawn was about to run away in front of his eyes, it would be strange if he could sit still. At this moment, the castle in the wind and snow was close at hand. Under the rustling snow, ghouls broke out of their vesicles one after another, quickly burrowing out. They hissed hungrily, and under the command of the horn, they gathered into an endless tide, surging towards the attackers. On top of the behemoth, Huaishir whistled, raised his hand, and patted Lousy Dog's head. Come on, give them the job. The behemoth shook its head in dissatisfaction. Unable to get rid of this annoying guy, it rolled its eyes. Then Bichimos took a deep breath. Chapter 1132. The icy snowfield fell into a terrifying silence at that moment. The wind was calm and the waves were calm. The snow fell without a sound. Only the distant and deep sound of the wind was left in the vast and mighty world, bursting out from the giant beast's lungs. Just like that, it calmly, greedily, and endlessly inhaled, until the snow that filled the sky was disturbed. Suddenly, a high temperature rose from the giant beast's body, melting the ice and evaporating the snow powder. It burned fiercely like a furnace. The long breath had reached its end. A playful and expectant smile appeared on the ferocious beast's face. Just like that, it opened its mouth towards the endless ghouls before it. It gently spat out the essence of destruction. Flames, hurricanes, molten steel, and even berserk plasma, all kinds of destruction converged into one and gushed out from Bichimo's mouth. A sword of blazing light appeared out of thin air. As Bichimo's neck swayed, it tyrannically sprinkled across the world. It swept, slashed, shook, burned the earth, dissolved the ghouls, and shrouded the entire castle in a vast and mighty destruction. In the end, it soared into the sky and shattered the eternal ice and snow, revealing the light of the heavens. The afterglow of the setting sun sprinkled down and reflected on the magnificent halo. It refracted magnificent rainbow-colored light, illuminating the dark and cold mortal world. Bichimos was now marching on the burning earth with its head held high. It forcibly took on the countless cannonballs, curses, and blazing lights that flew out from the castle. Those insignificant attacks merely burned 2 strands of its hair. When it took another deep breath, all the charred ghouls trembled violently. The pitch-black precipitate of hell and the embryonic form of calamity were extracted from their remains, converging into wisps of dark mist and plunging into the bottomless mouth. In the end, the devout sacrifice made up of countless deaths was exchanged for a gentle sigh of contentment. Burp! The giant beast flicked its tongue and looked back at the castle that was close at hand. Ji Shanggu's vision went dark. When the giant beast truly stepped into the range of the alchemy array and its greed fell on him, the alchemist of the Golden Dawn felt a bone-deep fear. Unlike the hesitation and panic brought by Cloud Lord, it was pure greed that seemed to have sprouted from the abyss. It was hungry and cruel, wanting to devour and destroy everything. It caused all living creatures to tremble in fear. Rancher? Even though they looked similar, his opponent this time was completely different from the rancher's miracle. Speaking of which, this life force that could grow without limit through devouring was more similar to the life force of the eternal beast. But beneath the two entirely different elements of destruction, there was something even more deadly hidden, an essence that terrified alchemists. But now, he had no time to think about anything else. The moment he came back to his senses, he no longer dared to slack off. He activated the secret device buried deep under the castle, and the alchemy array that covered the entire snowfield began to shrink. Abandoning all the corpse ghost vesicles that had been planted, the countless roots contracted and curled together, then suddenly extended, activating and awakening all the secret devices buried in the surroundings. All of his origin substance reserves were instantly emptied. What replaced it was a deep tremor that burst forth from beneath the earth. Around the castle, the countless mounds of varying heights began to sway. The melted snow was shaken off, breaking the layer of ice. The colossi that had been preheating for a long time finally propped up their bodies that were hundreds of meters tall. Amidst the deep rumbling of the rubbing of the boulders, the silhouettes that resembled giant bulls, birds, and even incomplete human figures squirmed. Accompanied by the tremor of the origin substance, they let out ear-piercing and mournful roars. It was like the cry of a dying man. Beneath Bichimo's head, Huaishur fell into a daze. He actually felt a tremor coming from the Book of Destiny. It was a reaction that belonged to the records of events. There were actually records of the kingdom of heaven around him. But when he surveyed the entire snowfield and gazed into the distance, he was unable to catch a glimpse of the brilliance of any of the books. Only the colossi of ice and stone that were so huge that it was suffocating were rapidly rising from the ground. Their scarlet eyes moved about their bodies and finally locked onto the enemy. There was absolutely no need for Huaishur orders and urging. Bichimo's had already launched an attack of its own accord. The gigantic beast that carried the heavenly palace opened its mouth and hissed. Once again, it spewed out a stream of flame that engulfed the short colossus at the front. The surging steam of steel brought about a cutting ability that was even more terrifying than a chainsaw. It easily tore apart its ice shell and stone skin, revealing layers upon layers of alchemy arrays underneath. Even the core of the arrays. That was a tattered page of a book. This was the fragment that the Book of Destiny had sensed, a genuine fragment. Using the remains of the records of spirits as a foundation, it bestowed intelligence and power to the dead. Everything that could be seen was the final miracle formed by the fragments that could no longer be used when the kingdom of heaven had fallen. And what one could hear were the mournful cries of countless dying spirits. It was as though the organs of the dying had been plucked out and soaked in life-saving pods to maintain their vitality. To actually be able to utilize the remains and wastes that had lost their value to such an extent was truly breathtaking. It also caused Huaishur to be unable to restrain his killing intent any longer. Bichimo's, kill them, the Inquisitor ordered coldly. Under his feet, the gigantic beast lifted its eyes. Countless teeth reflected the cold gleam of steel in its huge mouth. In an instant the earth quaked and the mountains swayed. Amidst the deafening sound of breaking air, Bichimo's finished accumulating power without warning. Its huge body that was as large as a building charged forward, setting off a hurricane. Use step. Immediately after, it brazenly collided with the colossus, causing the short mountain range to tremble and fall backward. Under the bombardment and ravaging of the drummer, it cracked inch by inch. There was no mercy at all. Aiming at the core of the alchemy array, the tattered page that was wailing in grief opened its mouth and spat out. In the rising flames, the record that had been suffering for so long was finally burned to ashes. But there were even more colossi that surrounded it with no regard for their own safety. They grabbed, tore, or slashed at it. Dazzling rays of light constantly spurted out from their eyes, leaving burn marks on the armor-like scales. But the rumbling of the collapse never stopped. Just like that, the greedy Tautai that opened its mouth would swallow and burn everything into ashes, even if it was a thick ice shell or iron stone that fell into its mouth. Bichimos roared at the top of its lungs. In the castle, a stern look appeared on Ji Shangu's face. In his hand, a pitch-black ancient book appeared. It was a condensed soul formed from the records of events that had been collected in the underworld. It recorded the enormous and terrifying creatures created by the condensation of countless calamities, as well as the bizarre existences that would only appear in imagination, as well as the true essence of the decay of all things. The Secret of the Worm. The moment the book appeared, Ji Shangu did not hesitate to dig out one of his eyes and put half of his soul into it. On the cover of the book, the face that resembled a human face devoured the soul and body of the contestant. Then, it opened its mouth, opened its bloodshot eyes, and roared at the top of its lungs. Wherever the roar passed, cracks would appear on the bodies of the colossi. In the incomplete records, wriggling ink stains would bulge out from the fragments, forming translucent worms of origin. Born by absorbing corruption and pain, the moment the worms of the book were born, they opened their mouths hungrily and extended towards Bichimos and Huai Shi. This won't do. The colossi and worms of the book can only buy us some time. In the castle, behind Ji Shangu, Doppler had already pulled out a sharp blade from the shadows. He squeezed out a voice from between his teeth. "Send me up there. Let me kill him." According to Alistair's analysis, all of Huai Shi's summoned creatures were related to the Book of Destiny. Once they lost the connection brought by Huai Shi with the Book of Destiny, they would be nothing more than water without a source, a tree without roots. They would not be a threat at all. If they could kill Huai Shi once here, it wouldn't matter even if they had to give up the entire stronghold. Moreover, before that, they were already prepared to perish together with Leyland. Ji Shangu nodded without the slightest hesitation. The secret ritual beneath his feet changed again. The shadow door that appeared in a flash rapidly took shape in midair. However, it was at that very moment that both of their expressions suddenly turned sluggish. They felt an intense pain bursting out from the depths of their souls. It was as if he had been struck in the head by an invisible axe. Their expressions convulsed and their eyes widened. Their dim vision was filled with blood. 2 streams of blood tears slowly flowed down their faces. "What the hell?" Ji Shangu roared hoarsely and subconsciously turned his head around. He saw that outside the window of the castle, separated by the fluttering snow, under the siege of those berserk colossi and worms of the book, there was a figure looking towards them. It was right above Bichimo's head. "Huai Shi, be careful." Ji Shangu's eyes widened. However, it was already too late. The moment Bichimos rushed to the edge of the castle, Huai Shi had already sensed it. Separated by layers of defenses and obstructions, several incomparably distinct auras, and the symbol that appeared above their heads. Black letter. It was an order to kill that was once issued by the Astronomy Club. It was a document to clean up solidified individuals and criminals. This was the inherent skill that Huai Shi's judge card carried. Once he entered the battlefield, all opponents who had received the black letter from the Astronomy Club would be forcibly deducted 1 drop of HP and their defense would be weakened. The moment the judge arrived at the surrounding area of the castle, the judgment from the present realm would once again appear from the distant past, marking the position of the enemy. Under the will of the judge, punishment would be meted out. Now, their judgment was looking at them. "Hello, everyone." Huai Shi smiled and greeted them gently. "Please open the door. The express delivery has arrived." He raised his hand and pulled the trigger. Super Mini Judgment Device, Lord of the Flies, activated. Immediately after, a dazzling light spurted out from the muzzle. It pierced through the colossi that were close at hand, tore apart the stinky worms, crossed a long distance in the snowstorm, and destroyed all the insignificant defenses. Finally, it entered the castle and exploded with a loud bang. This was the final scene that the solidified individuals saw. At that moment, death had arrived. Accompanied by the roar and loud noise of the castle's collapse, the raging thunder in the distance gradually dissipated and extinguished. Above the snowfield that was gradually returning to silence, a layer of fog had unknowingly risen. The thick paleness danced between the snow and ice, completely obscuring everything. Only the blood-curdling chewing sound could be heard from within. Soon, as the chewing sound dissipated, the curtain-like fog also disappeared into the distance. What was left in place was only the huge pit that was gradually covered by the snowstorm, announcing to all the observers the fate of the traitors. The trial that was 70 years late had just begun. Chapter 1133. On the land occupied by the abyss, in the domain of hell created by countless disasters, the Xingqiu territory set up by the fallen nation was engulfed by a sudden deep and thick fog. And none of the solidified people who dared to step into the wandering fog returned safely. Only the dwarf hunter known as the Thunder Tide escaped the thick fog through the rift and conveyed the destruction of the Xingqiu to the rulers. The ultimate behemoth created by the people of the present state was thrown into this battlefield. Enough! In the dark palace, the hoarse and low voice was interrupted by impatient words. In the dim light, everyone's expression was unsightly. The emissary of the Eye of Obscurity glanced at Alistair. That's enough. Do you want to add a voiceover like how the people of the present state play games? It's just to liven up the atmosphere. Alistair sat on a high chair, holding his chin and smiling. His other hand was still holding the paused remote control. Recently, I've been trying to think from the perspective of my opponent. Other than learning some bad habits, I've also gained something. Pfft! The strange eye sneered with obvious disdain. What did you gain this time? If you want to say it, you can only come to the conclusion that we will never be able to understand each other, right? Alistair smiled coldly, lowered his eyes, and looked down at the projection under his feet. In the three-dimensional projection that gradually reflected the entire interior of the Gaia fragment, in the darkness created by countless hells, there was a quiet white fog dancing on the ground. But even the white fog that covered thousands of miles could not hide the reverberating roar. The vibrations transmitted by the ground were like ripples, slowly spreading out from under the fog, revealing the terrifying things hidden within to the outside world. The thick fog gushed out endlessly from within. Wherever the white mist passed, everything returned to silence and deathly stillness. Once swallowed by the white mist, all the fortresses and large groups built in it would silently disappear. It was as if they had evaporated. Not even a drop of blood or a bone was left behind. The monster that was grinding its teeth and sucking its blood was hiding among them. It used the spreading white mist as its hiding place and wandered between hell, devouring and gluttoning to its heart's content. At this moment, in the hall that was isolated from the world, the participants who were projected here saw this scene again, and their expressions became increasingly gloomy. Who would like this kind of unexpected disaster? In less than 3 days, bad news came from the rear that should have been safe and sound. He had been robbed. The large group of people in hell and the solidified ones were squatting at home, eating hot pot and singing songs. In the end, they were robbed by celestial genealogy. Not only did they rob them of their money and their bodies, they didn't even have a complete corpse. Even the cursed sea-poisoned spring that Gloomy Eye had painstakingly cultivated had been emptied. Especially since the guy who broke through the void gate was someone who could eat and take. If he couldn't take anything away, he would smash it into dust. Furthermore, his appetite was extremely good, and he didn't care about food or cold. Wherever they passed, not to mention the warehouses and fortresses of hell, even the stones on the floor were scraped off. Even the plants in the flower pots were not spared. Damn it, just a moment of carelessness, and such a big thing had happened. In less than a few days, The pebbles that were originally rubbing their feet had turned into scars. They were itchy, painful, and useless when scratched. When pinched for a long time, there was no effect, but it was definitely so sore that it made people want to cry. For the current participants, the losses of these few days were not painful enough, but the problem was, it was too annoying. It was just like the mosquitoes buzzing in the mosquito net. How could it be so annoying? Now, those wild ghosts and remnants of celestial genealogy were about to seriously affect the construction and operation of the various systems in Hell. According to the estimates of the jesters, based on the growth rate of Huaishir's group, if they were allowed to continue, the itch that was difficult to get rid of now would probably evolve into endless pain in a few days. When that time came, it would really become a huge problem. Especially in the past 2 days, the situation at the front line had begun to become more and more critical. After a short period of rest and development, the group of ascendants in the present realm began to push forward crazily as if they had been injected with chicken blood. Especially on the side of East Xia, after Fusang rose into the sky, the support from Emperor Qing had already covered the entire battlefield. Coupled with the unkillable Quafu, it was simply a nightmare. Now, there was a large group of people sharpening their swords in front, and there was a guy at the back who had bad intentions and wanted to find a chance to ruthlessly kick your ass. No matter who it was, they would definitely curse. What the F***ck was Golden Dawn doing? Still touching? Now, the projections that descended here, in addition to communicating the situation and discussing countermeasures, their biggest purpose was to denounce Golden Dawn. That's not how it works, right? Alistair spread out his hands. You can't say that after you accepted the support and assistance we sent these days without blinking, you turned around and said that we didn't do anything. Didn't we participate in the creation of the blood and bone relay of the fallen country? Did the storm totems in the Thunder Sea fall from the sky? It's fine if you like to play with your own dark eye, but didn't the Eternal Age group use our fixed ladder? Why didn't Paradise say anything? From the beginning until now, weren't you the only ones who didn't achieve anything? In the projection, the minister of the Eternal Age group, who was dressed in a suit and leather shoes, pushed up his glasses and said calmly, "No one denies Golden Dawn's contribution, but ultimately, the reason why things have turned out this way is because you didn't do anything, right? Let's not talk about the loss of the heretic king. These days, Arthur and Bremeng were seriously injured, and Edward died, as well as the destruction of the 6 empty territories. Our efforts are obvious to all." Alistair glanced at him and replied coldly, "If someone thinks that we can't do it, we don't mind someone showing us a talent that far surpasses ours." His meaning was obvious. If you say that I can't do it, then why don't you do it? Sai, of course, we don't have any doubts about you. The minister of the Eternal Age group smiled helplessly and acted as a peacemaker. Now, we just want to discuss and come up with a plan. We can't possibly make everyone restless because of such a small problem, right? The others didn't say anything and couldn't be bothered to respond. Good fellow, you're the one who's condemning us, and you're the one who's being reasonable. You've said all the good and bad things, yet you're acting like you're in a company meeting? Behind Alistair, at the door, Woodman leaned against the door frame and watched the commotion with a smile. He didn't say a word from beginning to end. He just watched coldly from the sidelines. At this time, the difference between Hell and the present realm was obvious. Of course, once problems arose, such quarrels would be even more unavoidable. No one wanted to be the scapegoat, and similarly, they all had their own thoughts and plans. But no matter how chaotic the present realm was, there was still the Astronomy Association above their head. Under the 3 major blockades, all their efforts were directed towards one direction. Even if the situation was against the wind and all 3 paths were pushed through, as long as they could find an opportunity, there was still a possibility of a comeback. On the other hand, in the Abyss camp, everyone was a ruler, a king of hell, and even had the element of destruction. Who would listen to who? You want to build the Bone Dome, I want to send down the power of God, Eye of Obscurity wants to assimilate and reshape all things, and the Eternal Age Group is planning to monopolize everything. Doesn't Golden Dawn have their own plans too? Although no one would have any internal strife over this, it was inevitable to shift the blame, which was meaningless garbage time. Fortunately, after shifting the blame, they had to face reality. Then, no one was willing to speak. Only Woodman's cold laughter echoed outside the door. No matter how difficult it is on the chessboard today, isn't it still a chess piece? The representative from Eye of Obscurity asked impatiently. Let's just be straightforward and spend some capital. Can't we just kill it with a curse? Curse? That's a really good idea. Why didn't I think of that? Woodman couldn't help but clap vigorously and nod in agreement. Such a good idea, why don't we try it? The undisguised mockery in his words caused the shadows that formed the leader's body to begin to fluctuate, faintly showing anger and coldness. But at least it was a relatively cost-effective method. At least there was no need to mobilize a large number of people. So be it if they had to spend some capital. Soon, an old alchemist who had been solidified for hundreds of years took on the heavy responsibility. Known as the insect breeder, the solidifier had studied curses and origin substance pollution for many years and was very famous in Hell. Ever since he met Eye of Obscurity and received the ruler's guidance and grace, he was reborn from dissolution and was one of the top existences among the crowns. The secret ritual was completed, and the medium collected by Golden Dawn was sent over, with an entire group as sacrifice and sacrifice. Then there was no then. Under everyone's gaze, less than half a minute after the curse was cast, the insect breeder began to roll on the ground, screaming ear-piercingly. The bones all over his body were ravaged by an invisible force and shattered inch by inch. Even the replacement puppets all over his body were of no use. They could only watch as the puppets began to spontaneously combust out of thin air. In the end, as if they had been doused with gasoline, they were engulfed together with the cursed sun. In the fire, the insect breeder suddenly revealed a strange smile and screamed excitedly, I see, the sun, burning! I'm also burning! Just like that, he abruptly burned to ashes. A gentle breeze blew, and the ashes rustled. It was chilling. Not only in this world, but even outside the chessboard, the insect breeder who had returned to Hell did not leave behind any decent information or news. His soul, body, and all his treasures and workshops were burned to nothingness in the spreading flames the moment the cursed breeder returned. Only the flying ashes echoed in front of the participants as if they were mocking him. Not only the others, but even Woodman, who was watching the show, widened his eyes, feeling that this was unprecedentedly ridiculous. Was this too exaggerated? Was this still Yun Zhongjuan? Could it be that Huaishe, that little bastard, was actually the same as the old bastard? That she had secretly advanced into the Cloud Lord realm and was holding back a bellyful of bad farts to give them a traditional art show? Fortunately, there was no such possibility. The signs of Dong Jun's advancement were too obvious. They could be seen even at the bottom of the abyss, and there was no way to hide it. But who knew what kind of medicine Russell had fed him in just a few months? Judging by the pure qualitative change in his soul, Dong Jun's advancement was already set in stone. He was just one step away. Even if he was born to be a firewood, he could not be this fast, right? Or Alistair slowly frowned. When he and Woodman looked at each other, they could feel the coldness in each other's eyes. Was there an important factor behind Huaishe that they did not know about? Chapter 1134. This sudden speculation made the two of them feel uneasy for a long time. But other than Russell, who else was behind Huaishe? God? Which God? It couldn't be the one taken away by Golden Dawn, right? Mamakiria? Or a specimen in the Continuation Academy? But if the gods were active again, the Land of Dreams should be able to see the signs through the changes in the Pillar of Spirit. Or was it the group of living corpses of the pioneers? It couldn't be the element of destruction hiding behind the scenes, right? Countless possibilities emerged in his mind, but they were quickly denied. But when his thoughts wandered to the end of countless hypotheses, Woodman couldn't help but frown. This kind of speculation that could only rely on groundless speculation, this kind of unfounded familiarity, and this feeling of being deliberately led, it was as if he could hear Loki's sharp laughter hidden behind the scenes. Damn it! His originally calm emotions gradually began to become restless, uncontrollable anger. Once that old bastard was involved, it began to become a pain in the ass. Who knew if this was a smokescreen released by Loki to deliberately mislead them and disturb their minds and thoughts? But at the same time, it was impossible to tell. What if this was an empty fort strategy to beat Loki at his own game? It was difficult to distinguish between truth and falsehood. As long as Loki was still alive, all information and news related to him could not be easily trusted. If they wanted to fully support him, they could only respond step by step based on the current objective situation. Other than that, all guesses would only lead to the worst result. Because from the moment they began to think about the future, they might have already jumped into a trap. But no matter what, Huaishi's importance and threat had to be raised by another level. He was even more troublesome than Vice Principal Isaac. They couldn't let this guy stay here and be a hindrance. As you can see, the threat of Huaishi and the utopia he represents is far more than that. Alistair was the first to speak. If we want to solve the problem, I'm afraid we can't rely on something as simple as spells. We need to treat this more seriously. We? The tax official of the fallen country sneered, and did not give face at all. You want others to clean up the mess caused by Golden Dawn? Without you guys, things would be easier. But without Golden Dawn, wouldn't everyone have to face Utopia? Woodman sneered and retorted without even raising his eyelid. If you ask me, what you're facing now is not the mythical lineup of the Utopia 70 years ago, but a group of homeless ghosts. It's only right that you thank us. However, if we continue to let it go, it might not end up like this. The sinister chill in his words caused the entire hall to fall silent for a moment. With Woodman's reminder, the rulers of Hell seemed to have seen a giant monster crawling over the city walls. Once again, he recalled the shadow and humiliation created by the Republic. Right now, there are only two people, the creator of cycles and Yun Zhongjuan. One of them is a scholar, while the other isn't even a Tier 5. Yet, they're already a huge threat to us. Alistair calmly added, if we give him a little more time and let him call out a few more people, such as Osiris, Black God, White God, Heimdall, Nuada, I don't need to remind you of what will happen then, do I? Without waiting for the others to express their opinions, he took the lead and said, under the premise of not delaying the construction of the stairway to heaven, we will send out the heretic monarch, Woodman, and Bennett. However, if he still has any other trump cards hidden, we might not be able to catch all of them in one fell swoop. At that time, no matter what the consequences are, Golden Dawn will not care anymore. As soon as he said this, the expressions of everyone in the hall changed one after another. They were cautious, puzzled, or angry. Or rather, they were the former Utopia. Their attitude of, I'm all in, you guys can do whatever you want, was no different from their arrogant attitude in the past. However, this time, the deceased tax official, who had been staying out of the meeting just now, spoke first. The fallen country will send out the Wild Hunting Legion to assist your plan. In addition, that lord is also interested in one of the target. The tax official, who looked like a mummy, raised his empty eyes and warned, I hope you don't fail to appreciate our kindness and snatch that lord's prey without permission. Immediately after, the priest of the rancher said, a saint will cooperate with your operation, but that giant beast will be left for us to deal with. The Sea of Thunder will temporarily awaken the storm totem for you. The dwarf king coldly tossed the exquisite metallized skull at the tip of his finger. If there is a valuable prey, we will not hesitate to take action. We will do the same. The jester agreed with a hoarse voice. Soon, in the dark hall, the rulers reached a consensus once again. Before the real war began, they had to get rid of this scourge that was wandering among their trusted subordinates. However, even though they had decided on a general strategy, before the war began, they were still arguing endlessly over the distribution and disposal of the spoils of war. Woodman rolled his eyes and did not want to waste any more time. However, before he left, he saw the scene in the deepest part of the hall. In that secluded darkness, Alistair's expression there was no excitement or fanaticism. It was as if he was a statue that was not involved in the matter. It was so calm. TSK, Woodman frowned slightly and turned to leave. Under the gloomy sky, the earth rumbled. The fog seemed to be surging endlessly, spreading to the ends of the world. It was difficult to see the ferocious aura hidden within. Only the traces of scarlet that could not be dispersed lingering in the fog could show the ferociousness of the giant beast. Bichimos moved forward amidst the loud rumbling that shook the earth. Ever since Lord Yun Zhongjuan created the screen, the giant beast had become like a ghost, difficult to predict its movements. The only thing that could be heard was the sound of chewing when it was eating. It made one's scalp go numb. Oh my, I'm only a few minutes late, but it seems like a huge piece of someone's backyard has been dug out. Woodman laughed strangely and glanced at the gloomy dwarf king, not bothering to hide his ridicule. The dwarf king snorted coldly and crushed the metallized skull in his hand. He raised his skinny and slender hand and grabbed at the fog in the projection. In the distance, a storm suddenly howled. Amidst the rumbling of thunder, a wave suddenly emerged above the thick fog. Under the will of the dwarf king, the power of the storm totem crossed a long distance and suddenly descended. It caused the fog to tremble violently under the ravaging of an invisible hand like a blanket. A tidal wave was set off. Then, the fog collapsed. Under the attack of the storm, the fog that had spread for hundreds of kilometers produced a sound similar to that of silk being torn apart. Cracks appeared in the middle of the fog, dancing and quickly dissipating. On the ground, Bichimos raised its beastly face. Strands of lightning flickered on its horns. In just a few hours, the monster had grown even stronger. Their appearance was even more exaggerated than the blessed teeth under the rancher's command. In less than a few minutes, more than half of the watchtower in the center of the fog had disappeared in the mouth of the greedy Tautai. The remaining watchtower was still supporting its body with great difficulty and had yet to collapse. A gust of wind blew past. Under the overlooking gaze of the rulers, a sound similar to that of crying could be heard. But what made everyone even more astonished was that the gigantic beast seemed to have sensed the danger descending from the sky. Before that, it decisively abandoned the food it had not finished eating and ran away. Moreover, compared to the trembling of the earth and mountains in the past, there was not even the slightest sound of footsteps when it ran away. Its speed was also ridiculously fast. That clumsy appearance it usually had was simply an act to fool people. If the Dwarf King's reaction was just a little bit slower, perhaps that fellow would have escaped from the encirclement, but now it was already too late. The moment everything was exposed to the sunlight, a dazzling radiance suddenly appeared in the sky. The Saint of Hell from the Blessed Lands descended from the sky like a meteor. Countless gorgeous jewels were wrapped around his skeletal arms. They swayed in the wind, and the pearls embedded in his skull shone brightly. A solemn melody praising the god of hell was played under the will of the saint, forcefully suppressing the noise in the light wheel. Only this voice that belonged to the true God was left in the world. There was no room left for Huaishur to use. Following that, the earth trembled. Countless dust particles rose from the cracks in the ground. Under the call of the pious hymn, pale skeletal hands suddenly reached out from the cracks in the ground and climbed up. Countless skeletal hands piled up, forming a strange spectacle that stretched as far as the eye could see. That was the sacrifice of countless fanatics who had sacrificed themselves for the cause. Countless skeletons piled up to form an iron wall that could not be crossed. It was the wall of believers that completely sealed off the domain within a radius of tens of kilometers. Without waiting for the saint of hell to do anything, the calamities of the jesters surged in the sky. Cold, dark green flames appeared in the empty air. Invisible flames. Although they appeared to be flames, the flame-like shadows were actually distorted vortexes formed from matter that had deepened substantially in a short period of time. Once contaminated, even the ascended would not be able to avoid the distortion of the body and soul. Assassins. The endless flames connected with each other and covered the sky. After isolating Cloud Lord from the cycle of heaven and earth, they turned into a lid that covered the top of the wall of believers. Deep underground, the worms of the Eye of Darkness stirred the magma in a frenzy and shuttled rapidly. The sky, the earth, and even the surroundings were sealed within in an instant. In this small box, there was only prey that had nowhere to run. The time for the hunt had come. Right in front of Bichimos, a pale, frosty wind swept past. The mighty roar of galloping war horses spread out from within. Wild Hunt. The Wild Hunt Corps from the fallen kingdom advanced forward in a mighty manner like a tidal wave. The tens of thousands of soldiers worked together as if they were one entity. When the earth wailed under the iron hooves, the entire world seemed to be on the verge of collapse as it trembled. But at this moment a disdainful snort rang out. Between the behemoth and the core, a mournful lightning suddenly burst forth. A blurry figure slowly walked out from it. Holding a long weapon in his hand, he looked disdainfully at the formation in front of him. At that moment, on the solemn golden chariot, the demon from Sumer raised his scarlet eyes. Ing. Feng. Zhou! Gala clenched the sharp blade in his hand and roared loudly. Indescribable ecstasy and unprecedented killing intent emerged from that pair of eyes at the same time. It was difficult to distinguish whether it was anger or joy. The enemy was clearly in front of him, but that figure did not seem to have heard him. He did not even raise his head to look at him. Such a contemptuous attitude and such a familiar sense of humiliation made Gala's smile even more ferocious. Then, without waiting for the corps behind him, he stepped on the surging waves of blood and galloped forward in an instant. A fishy wind blew in his face. Die! The demon laughed shrilly and slashed down with the golden sword. Bang! At that moment, in the dissipating lightning, the burly figure finally raised his head. But that face illuminated by the sparks made Gala instantly stunned. Huh? Are you calling me? Kwafu asked blankly, but my surname is not Ing. Finally, a familiar voice came from behind Gala. Are you looking for me? Yun Zhongjuan asked in a cold voice. Then, the hateful water roared and the purified lightning soared into the sky. It surged and left a deep cut on the sky full of flames. It pierced through. Light fell from the sky behind the crack, illuminating the outline of the behemoth. And on Bichimos's back, there were a few figures who should never have appeared here: East Xia, Rome, Russian Federation, India, America. Every face was completely different. The only thing they had in common was the pure source substance that was constantly surging in their bodies, as well as the iron-like killing intent. Level 5, Level 5, Level 5, and more Level 5. They were all F*King Level 5. At that moment, all the participating rulers could not help but feel their vision go dark. F*CK. Chapter 1135. As long as one was alive, regardless of whether it was a human or a monster, there would always be a period of time where one would start to think about the meaning of life, the universe, and the world under the sudden blow of reality. It was just like the time of a sage, just like now. Not only all the rulers participating in the war, but even the hell chess players outside the world fell into a daze. They started to think, who am I? Where am I? Where am I going? And most importantly, What the F***ck is going on? Why are there so many F***king 5th grade existences here? Quafu of East Xia, Turul of the Holy Spirit of the Russian Federation, Traltakutli and Sepetitek of the Americas, Agni of India, unknowingly, almost all the 5th grade existences who entered the fragment had gathered here. That damned thick fog was not there to help the behemoths hide their tracks at all. Even Bichimos was nothing more than a distraction to attract attention. Everything that was done behind the scenes was to quietly complete the gathering of power, allowing the 5 fingers from the present realm to pinch together. Behind the concealment of the curtain, they clenched their fists. Hunting? No war. The war had begun. 2 days ago, above the collapsed castle, snowflakes fell endlessly, fluttering in the wind, gradually covering the cold corpses. Amidst the chewing sounds that sounded like a landslide, Huaishur sat on the collapsed ruins, quietly looking into the distance. The iron piece that he picked up casually spun on his fingertip. It was just a habitual action when he was thinking. When he returned to reality from his thoughts, the thunder in the distance had come to an end. Yun Zhongjuan, covered in blood, returned. Seeing Huaishur's expectant gaze, he snorted unhappily. His hands were empty. He did not bring back anything. Where's Edward? Huaishur was stunned. Killed, Ing Fangzhou replied. That guy has too many trump cards. If he's alive, there will be endless trouble. It's not good to hold back. While he's weak, we should kill him if we can. Not a single usable one was left. Huaishur sighed, regretting that he didn't leave anyone alive. It couldn't be helped. Golden Dawn was indeed the Golden Dawn. The position of her neck and head were too perfect. One couldn't help but touch her. There was no more after that. There's no point in staying. Ing Fangzhou wiped the blood off his face and expressionlessly pulled out the bone spurs and abnormal tissues that grew out of his body. He asked coldly, in this gamble, do you still expect to dig out anything useful from your opponent? Huaishur shrugged and complained, this is the only bad thing about card games. The degree of freedom is too low. Even if there was a vast and endless Gaia fragment in front of them, enemies from countless hells, and the gathering of all the elites of the present realm, it was still a gamble in the hands of the players. With the safety of the present realm as a chip, and the records of events represented by the All-Ages tablet as a chess piece, a war was waged. Both sides descended in the form of information like record. Even if they died, they could return to their bodies. Moreover, they could clearly distinguish between friend and foe. There was no gap for others to exploit. For Huaishur, who liked to use tricks and other means, it was a nightmare. The days are getting worse and worse. Huaishur looked up to the sky and sighed. The good days are about to come to an end. He wasn't arrogant enough to think that he could repeatedly jump around in hell just by relying on golden thighs. When facing the top opponents in the entire abyss, even 2 golden thighs weren't enough. He could already foresee the crazy counterattack of hell in the future. Are you going to run? Leaning on the chair, old Lady Evelyn suddenly asked. Of course I'm going to run, and I have to run fast. I have to run at a high standard and exciting level. Huaishur suddenly stopped spinning the metal piece at his fingertips, reflecting his smile. But before that, since I'm already here, I have to do something big first, right? Even if he wanted to run, it had to be a hit and run. It was too shameful for him to fall down before the other party could do anything. Therefore, he had to think of a way to give him a hard time. Even if you want to do something, you have to have the capital. Chaucel poured cold water on him. Think carefully. There are only a few people. There's nothing to do. I'm an old woman. I can't afford to be tossed around. At this time, we can only play to the traditional advantage of celestial genealogy. Huaishur slapped his knee. Let's summon people. Regardless of when celestial genealogy had such a good tradition, from today onwards it would be like this. Therefore, under the fog unfolded by Yun Zhongjuan, Huaishi's communication flew to the distance behind him through the vice principal's relay. "Hello? Is little Liz there? Oh, don't be so distant. We're so familiar with each other. We've been through life and death together. Hello? Is old Lady Qing there? Are you in good health? Don't you think I miss you? I want you to give me more guidance. Hello? Rome? Oh, Mr. Vulcan, I've heard a lot about you. Oh, Senior Blade Master is also there? Just in time. Do you want to do something big?" In less than 5 minutes, Huaishi's proposal had been conveyed to every player and the leader of the genealogy. Everyone's first reaction was to take off their glasses and rub their eyes. Then, they asked Huaishi if he had made a mistake. But then, everyone felt that there seemed to be something going on. When Huaishi took out the big cake that he had prepared, everyone, who originally wanted to be reserved for a while, could not help but begin to feel tempted. As the leader of the Gaia Fragment Middle East genealogy, old Lady Qing did not hide anything and asked directly, "What do you want to do after all this trouble?" Huaishi replied without hesitation, "Of course, I want to kill those sons of bitches from Golden Dawn." "Ha ha." Emperor Qing sneered and did not give face at all. "Putting selfishness above public duty doesn't look like the head of the family, Huaishi. Look at what you're saying. Isn't this the benefit of being the head of the family?" Huaishi replied calmly, "Sometimes it's not a big deal when selfishness and public duty overlap." "You've become thick-skinned, Huaishi." Emperor Qing sighed. Huaishi just smiled and took it as a compliment from old Lady Qing. "But I still have a question," Emperor Qing asked coldly. "Since you admit that this is a personal grudge, why should I help you? Isn't this what you're happy to see?" Huaishi laughed. "Since you need a fuse to ignite the dynamite between the present realm and hell, what do you think? Then why can't I be the fuse?" As a veteran shit-stirrer, he was the sword of disaster that would blow up wherever he went. He knew his troublemaking nature too well. Wasn't it a critical moment between the present realm and hell on the verge of breaking out? Who else could be up to this important responsibility other than himself? Emperor Qing did not speak again. He did not comment. But before ending the communication, he laughed one last time. Although he's still a little inexperienced, his attitude of, "who else can do it but me," is a little bit of utopia. As a result, from the moment the agreement was reached, within 2 days, the entire camp in the present realm was in full swing in preparation for the upcoming war. On the one hand, the ostentatious display of heavy troops constantly harassed the defense line of hell. On the other hand, they were secretly preparing for a transfer. They were waiting for the signal from afar. Waiting for the arrival of the war, and now, when this iron fist formed by the 5 fingers of the present realm was revealed under the light of the day, there was only one result left. Wrapped in the power accumulated over a long period of time, it was mercilessly thrown forward. There was no need for refined meat or fat meat, and there was no need to carefully cut it into minced meat. It was not specially made to entertain you. As long as a soy sauce shop was opened on your head, red, white, and purple would flow out, and what was even more creepy, was that as the rounds turned, all the chess players of the present realm uniformly showed kind smiles to their opponents. In their hands, the cards that they had formed for 3 rounds were thrown out as if they were free. At this moment, countless rays of light fell from the sky like meteors. Thus the world shook. Framework, a realm of myriad transformations. The combination of the laws from the Creator instantly broke through the blockade of hell, once again opening up the 4 sides of heaven and earth, blessing all the ascendants with the protection of the present realm. Miracle mark a cherubims. The emblem of an archangel with 6 overlapping wings suddenly appeared between heaven and earth, sweeping away all the curses and precipitation of hell. The 4-edged rotating flaming sword guarding in front of the gate of Eden slashed down from the sky without warning, stabbing into the ground, instantly causing thick smoke to spurt out from the soil. Deep underground, countless worms were incinerated into ashes. Then, miserable shrieks could be heard. Then, stars fell like rain. Countless miraculous rays of light descended from outside the chessboard, landing between the present realm and hell, forming an army from myth. Longbow guards, Night Hospitaller, American skin flayers, Rakshasa, abyss white doves, countless enemies appeared out of thin air, causing the jester's water mirrors to be crushed. Furious roars. What the hell? What was going on? Just for one why sure, the entire present realm was going to go bankrupt? Such a sudden and drastic change left everyone dumbfounded. It was hard to understand. What kind of logic was this? Where did they get so many source substances? Where did they get so many reserves? Where did they get the money? Why was it so different from the data they had calculated? Where did the gap in the middle come from? The answer was given by Huaishur. Admittedly, the rulers were very thorough in their considerations. They came to the most correct conclusion at the first moment, understanding the destructive power Huaishur could cause, and gathered their forces to the greatest extent, intending to destroy this disaster in one fell swoop. The only thing they neglected was how ridiculous Bichimo's ability to produce and pay as a high-grade celestial genealogy building was. It was just like how people would always forget that Heaven's Inquisition was actually a support system. There would always be people who would be confused by Bichimo's terrifying appearance, causing them to overlook its essence. Because it was too similar to existences like the Rancher and the Beast of Eternal Life, it caused everyone to misunderstand, thinking that this monster was some kind of terrifying weapon of war. But in fact, it wasn't like the Rancher who devoured everything for its own sake, nor had it built any cycle of the abyss food chain. Although it was huge and tenacious, it was only mediocre when compared to the Beast of Eternal Life. Its terrifying appetite was to allow its huge body to grow even further, while its huge body was for better appetite and digestion. Endless devouring, endless growth. This body was a temple formed by the combination of endless source substances, miracles, and disasters. If the greatest miracle that had appeared during the Night of the Witch was the Silver Ocean, then this body was the vessel that the Silver Ocean relied on to survive. But since it was a vessel, it meant that the things that were put in could be taken out again. It was like a piggy bank filled with piggy banks, a safe with 4 legs, or a bank vault with a big mouth. This thing was a super large power bank. Now, after 3 days of gorging itself, relying on the rewards and feeding of its old friends from hell, Bichimo's, who was as huge as a mountain, lay down on the battlefield in satisfaction. Licking its lips, it observed the battle that was close at hand. On its back, a massive halo of light burned like a sun. Endless amounts of origin substance surged, releasing a blinding light. The silent hymn was played once again. Holy! Chapter 1136. The moment the hymn rang out, everything was completely different. The loud noises and roars that rose and fell on the battlefield seemed to have been given substance. Under the control of invisible hands, they burst forth, spread, and surged unceasingly. It was obviously a fleeting scream, but the lingering sound lingered in the ears, wishing to linger for 3 days. It was clearly a majestic sound that caused the earth to crack, but before it could spread out, it was crushed to death in its cradle. Only a faint moan like that of a mosquito was drowned out by the noise that was like a tide. At this moment, all the sounds seemed to have lost their original rhythm and form. Under the gaze of a certain pair of eyes, they rapidly changed, grew, or were cruelly cut off. In the end, they turned into invisible blades and swords. The hymn that belonged to the Rancher thus fell apart under the shaking of the waves, dissecting into meaningless fragments. It was as though in the midst of the endless slaughter and struggle of the war, there was only one main axis left between the heavens and the earth. The only sound. The hymn of praise that lingered above the wheel of light. Impudent! The saint of hell roared furiously. Scarlet flames burned fiercely in his hollow eyes. under the siege of Turul and Cypatotic. He suddenly turned his head and looked with resentment at the center of the enormous wheel of light, the mountain-like head of Bichimos. Why sure! On the flat surface of the dog's head, the young man sitting cross-legged seemed to have heard a call from afar. He raised his head slightly. Then, he withdrew his gaze without any interest. Whistling, he picked up the boiling kettle and poured hot water into the teacup, looking down at the appearance of the tea leaves floating in the water. Finally, he picked up the teacup and took a sip. The smell of smoke and blood in the wind was replaced by the bitter tea fragrance. He smacked his lips, frowned, and poured the tea into the wind. He continued to boil water. Humming a song, he leisurely enjoyed the scenery. Obviously, he was the one who started the war, but now he was completely uninvolved. He was calm and leisurely. He had already spent money to hire people to fight, so why should he personally go into battle? A third rank? A gift? This time, the 6 major sects are besieging the light summit. He slapped his knee and sighed. Finally, he waved his fist and shouted at his allies, "There's no need to follow the rules of the martial world when dealing with these demons. Everyone attack together! Attack together!" Now, not to mention the solidifiers in the abyss, even Kwafu couldn't help but want to smash his head with a hammer. Under the tax officer's angry roar, dust flew up and the earth shook. Suddenly, a scarlet color of blood rose from the crowd that was slaughtering like a black tide. Countless pale white skeletons piled up in one place, transforming into a colossus of skeletons that was hundreds of meters tall with 2 heads and 4 arms. Wantonly trampling on the dust beneath its feet, it charged madly towards Bichimos. Good job, kill him! Kill this bastard with one punch! This thought surfaced in the minds of countless allies. But very soon they came to their senses. This bastard must not die. If he did, Bichimos's source substance supply would be gone. At present, a large part of the source substance used by all the 5th-rank cultivators on the battlefield came from Bichimos's light wheels. Once Bichimos was damaged, everyone would be cut off from the internet. You want to cut off my Wi-Fi? In your King dreams. An angry roar rang out. Under the siege of the dwarf hunters from the thunderous sea, Kwafu lifted the golden fishing rod in his hand without even turning his head and threw it behind him. The fishing rod forged from Shoyang mountain copper and miracle of longbow expanded against the wind, crossing more than half of the battlefield in an instant. Under the guidance of the fishing hook, the thin line soared in the air like a bird, coiling around the colossal bone and gently hanging on it. Immediately after, the ground within a radius of 1 mile sank by 60 centimeters. Amidst the rumbling sounds of mountains collapsing, the colossal statue was actually pulled by the thin line. Dragged by Kwafu, it involuntarily rose into the air and made a circle on the battlefield. Wherever it passed, countless people were tossed into the air like ants. A deep fissure was formed where it landed. Above the crack, the flames gathered once again, forming the burning silhouette of Agni once more. Someone heard the Indian level 5 curse. If not for his quick reaction, he would have been buried alive by his allies. However, on the battlefield, the one with the greatest momentum was neither Kwafu nor the giants from the Americas. Instead, it was the dazzling bolt of lightning that wandered in the blood tide at the center of the battlefield. Following Lord Yunzhongjuan's will, a forest of thunderbolts pierced out from the clouds. However, they did not dissipate. Instead, they solidified in the air as if they had materialized, gradually forming a cage of destruction. The heavenly drum vibrated, producing a loud sound. Countless raindrops fell, turned into water vapor, and rose into the air, once again forming a huge cycle. Countless dead lives, shattered souls, and even dissipated source substances were included in this cycle, gathering in Yingfangzhou's hands. Raising thousands to serve one. A control-type support like Lord Yunzhongjuan was just so annoying. Once the cycle was formed, in his cycle, regardless of whether they were enemies or friends, willing or not, they were all a part of the cycle and would provide him with power. It was just like how once Huai Shi's heavenly palace was opened, all the dead souls on the battlefield would be forged into iron in the furnace. The larger the battlefield, the more people there were, and the more chaotic it would be. The more dissipated source substances, miracles and disasters, the more power would flow into his hands in the end through the cycle. According to the original setting, he should have blessed his allies with this power, so that there would be no shortage of people. But for Ying Fangzhou allies? What allies? I don't see them. As the former number 1 attacker of the Path of Heaven's Inquisition, giving up his position? That's impossible. You guys lie down, I'll take over. Now, the 6th degree purified lightning gathered above the waters of hatred, wantonly scattering everywhere. Wherever it passed, the blood sea collapsed, the tide was torn apart, and everything in its path was swept away. With Lord Yun Zhongjuan's rank, this destructive power was already above that of many level 5 existences. And right in front of him, the demon, who was directly hit by the waters of hatred, fell into the blood sea again. But then, he rose up again, laughing wildly in excitement. That's it. Ying Fangzhou, that's it. Let me see your angry face more, it's so delightful. Gala laughed wildly. There was only a small wound on his gold-studded body, but he was not damaged at all. In his hand, the king's sword of nobility, which had been bestowed upon him by the withered king, shone brightly and emitted a boundless evil light. This was a reward comparable to the position of a ruler. As the guard and follower of the King of Withered, and the leader of the Imperial Guards, Gala had made many contributions to the fallen country in a long time. The King of Withered even bestowed authority as a reward, enfeoffing the territory of the fallen country, and promoting him to a member of the ruler. But the demon scoffed at this generous reward. In the entire abyss and countless hells, there was only one true ruler and true emperor. Other than that, everyone else was just a figurehead. This was his answer. Was he happy because of this loyalty, or was he laughing because of this stubbornness? No one knew the meaning of the King of Withered's laughter. He just casually threw the crown aside, and then bestowed a sword as a reward for his loyal hound. From that moment on, Gala became the hand of the fallen country. Wherever the king's sword of nobility was, all the forces of the fallen country's army would surrender in front of this sword, offering their souls, bodies, blood, bones, and even everything. Even the other rulers of the fallen country would do the same. This was the genuine sword of 10,000 armies. With this sword, one could mobilize the power of the army and a large group of people without limit and integrate it into oneself. Now, Gala had truly become the embodiment of the fallen country. He unleashed this power so wantonly that he did not care about his allies. He even crushed the worms and monsters that rushed up to get in his way, just to fight to his heart's content. The storm rose from the ground under the slash of the sharp blade, turning into a tornado that rose into the sky against the lightning. It wandered wantonly, sweeping up a large amount of blood and corpses, decorating the stage that belonged to the war. Blood and lightning collided fiercely. Yun Zhongjuan snorted coldly, and the lightning in his hand trembled, faintly showing signs of collapse. But soon, the lightning condensed again. After turning from pure white to pitch black, it underwent 3 more evolutions. Now, there was no longer the outline of lightning in his hand, only a strange halo that filled the air. 9 degrees of purification. Again, the heavenly palace roared, and tens of thousands of lightning bolts fell. The battle was not just in the hinterland of hell. Whether it was the chess players in the present realm or the leaders of the various lineages, they would never allow such a precious opportunity to be wasted. Just when most of the forces of the abyss were involved in another place, a fierce attack on the enemy's border began again. Although 2 days of preparation was not enough to form a decisive advantage in a short period of time, with the sudden attack at this moment, the front line had begun to move forward. Above the sky, the violent bombardment of the imprint of Miracle Fusofel, and countless wood demons had torn apart the Rashomon line of defense set up by the Golden Dawn. A large number of wood demons drove straight in, and under various spells such as shrinking and shifting, they pushed forward with terrifying efficiency. On the eastern front, after 4 pastures were uprooted in a row, the fasting circle of the blessed land was in imminent danger. Amidst the pure white smoke from the burning of the holy oil, the knights from the Russian alliance roared and shouted. They were clad in heavy armor, and the huge horses they rode neighed as they ran amuck among the countless domesticated monsters. It was as if an invisible plow had been shoveled down from the sky, plowing blood and death. Wherever it passed, a deep crack had been dug out in the black tide. Straight forward! From one end of the battlefield they dug through to the other end, then they turned around and did it again. When tens of thousands of troops gathered as one, the knights blessed by the Holy Spirit merged into one, sharing the same soul, the same miracle, and the same blessing. The badge of the Maltese cross was like an eagle, flapping in the smoke. And in this turbulent battle, there seemed to be a moment of complete silence. All the noise disappeared without a trace, and all the movements froze in the air. The galloping knights stopped abruptly in the midst of the enemy, and everyone was frozen in place. Then, shrill screams spread out from under the armor, and distortion and solidification spread among the army that had turned into a record of events. In just 3 short flicks of the fingers, the holy light disappeared without a trace. What replaced it was a viscous black flame that flowed out continuously from the gaps of the armor. The distorted giant horse slowly turned around and faced its allies behind it. A brazen change of sides. At this moment, outside the chessboard, the pure white of the Knight Hospitaller had been completely dyed black with the sudden solidification. The label that appeared on the chessboard also changed slowly, revealing a mocking smile to the chess players. Knight Hospitaller, Woodman. From this moment onwards, this large group of elites broke away from the hands of the present realm and belonged to the ranks of Hell, becoming the vanguard of Hell. And it was through this short gap that the power of the jesters merged into the battlefield, causing the originally clear situation to once again return to chaos. As for the feelings of the chess players, perhaps only the word disgusting could describe it. Damn the Golden Dawn! It was just like facing the hell creatures in the Utopia. Now, it was the turn of the present realm's sublimators to angrily scold how there was such a thing that messed with people's minds. As a member of the Golden Dawn, Woodman, who now used Faust as a medium to descend, had lost his framework and laws. Now, he was the incarnation of the devil Mephisto, and he only had 2 skills: formlessness and shift. The former allowed Woodman to not have a physical body, and he could not be killed by material or source attack. The latter allowed him to quickly corrupt and control all creatures with souls with a sufficient supply of source substances. If sublimators with independent souls were a little difficult to deal with, dealing with this large group that could only produce qualitative changes in numbers was easier than yawning for him. Unless it was a stigmata that specialized in controlling souls or a divine mark in the same field, it was a nightmare. Not only could they not be killed, driven away, or dispelled, but if they were not careful, they could be read, brainwashed, and corrupted. They were like flies that kept buzzing in their ears, disgusting to the core. At this time, they could only use something even more disgusting. Only magic could defeat magic. If they encountered someone who messed with their minds, they could only use a more mind-messing method to get back at them. At that moment, the chess player from India, Arudni, threw out the card in his hand expressionlessly. Sincerity, Stone Curse Immortal. A level 5 sublimator from India who maintained the system, the peak of all ascetic practices and cultivation, the embodiment of all things karma. Brahman Immortal. Now, feel the horror of great wishes and curses. You're tuning in to the Phoenix Knights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.